She walked into the ballroom like a woman walking to her own execution. Every chandelier blazed, every eye turned, every whisper sharpened into a blade. They said Clara Whitmore was too proud for her poverty, too wild for London, too stubborn to survive a single season without ruining herself completely. They were right about one thing: she was dangerous, but not in the way they imagined, because the most powerful man in London, the Duke who had never lost a single conquest, was about to meet the one woman who would refuse to be won, and everything would burn. Asim, welcome back, everyone. This is a story about pride, survival, and what happens when two people too stubborn to love each other can't stop. Stay until the very end. You will not see the final twist coming. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments right now. Let's begin. The carriage hit a rut in the road, and Clara Whitmore grabbed the leather strap above the window with both hands. Her jaw clenched against the jolt. Outside, the fog of early morning London pressed against the glass like something alive, gray and thick and suffocating, smelling of coal smoke and wet cobblestones, and the particular kind of ambition that only a city this size could manufacture. She had never hated a smell more in her life. "You're gripping that strap as though you intend to rip it free," said her mother, Margaret Whitmore, from the seat across. Margaret's posture was immaculate despite 6 hours of hard travel. Her spine had never once met the back of any chair in Clara's memory. "A lady does not white-knuckle the carriage fittings, Clara." "A lady," Clara said, watching the fog, "does not get sold at auction either, and yet here we are." The silence that followed was not empty. It was packed tight with years of the same argument, worn smooth from repetition, its edges no longer sharp enough to draw blood, but heavy enough to bruise. Margaret Whitmore looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she looked away. She did not correct the word sold. Clara was 22 years old, which, in the language of the London season, meant she was already operating at a disadvantage. Most debutantes arrived at 17, fresh and unformed, their personalities still soft enough to be shaped by the drawing rooms and assembly halls and the long, careful machinery of aristocratic courtship. At 22, you were expected to know better, to want it more desperately, to be grateful for whatever notice remained. Clara Whitmore had grown up in Dorset, in a house called Whitmore Grange that sounded grander than it was. The house itself was honest. Stone walls, leaking eaves in the east wing, a kitchen garden that Clara had personally expanded 3 times over because she found dirt more satisfying than embroidery, and a library that her father had built before his health failed him. The library was the truest thing about the place. Floor to ceiling, packed with books that had been read and reread and argued over, margins filled with pencil notations in 4 different handwritings across 3 generations. Her father, Edward Whitmore, had believed in argument as a form of love. You did not agree to be polite in his house. You engaged. You pushed back. You defended your position, or you abandoned it honestly when you were wrong. He had died 14 months ago, in the autumn, quietly, in his chair by the library fire. What he had left behind was considerably less quiet. The debts had not come as a surprise exactly. Clara had known, in the vague way that children of distracted fathers often know, that the money was less than it had once been. There had been the selling of the East Pasture, then the dismissal of 3 household staff. Then the year her mother had stopped ordering new fabric entirely, and had begun wearing her old gowns with the hems altered so precisely that only Clara, who had helped with the alterations herself, knew they were not new. But the full accounting, laid out by their solicitor, Mr. Farrow, in his dry, apologetic monotone 3 weeks after the funeral, had been something else entirely. The Whitmore estate was not merely reduced, it was failing, quietly, steadily, with the dignity of something that had once been fine and could not quite accept what it had become. There was enough to maintain Whitmore Grange for perhaps 2 more years, if nothing unexpected occurred, if the harvest was sufficient, if the roof of the main hall, which had been showing alarming signs of distress since the winter storm in February, did not finally give way. If Mr. Farrow had used that word so many times that Clara had begun to hear it in her sleep. "There are options," he had said, folding his hands on his desk with the careful precision of a man delivering news that was technically information but functionally a sentence. "Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Whitmore, the London season begins in April. Miss Whitmore is of prime age and— He had paused, recalibrated. Miss Whitmore has considerable natural attributes. Claire had stared at him across his neat solicitor's desk and thought, he means I am not plain. He means my face is passable, and my father was a gentleman, and therefore someone might pay for the privilege of my name attached to theirs. She had not said any of that aloud. She was getting better at not saying things aloud. London, her mother said now, as the carriage rolled deeper into the city and the buildings grew taller and the fog refused to lift, is not a punishment, Clara. I know. It is an opportunity. The Hargrove family has been kind enough to offer us the use of their townhouse for the full season. That alone represents a significant— I know, Mother. Lady Hargrove has connections on the Patronesses Committee for Almack's. If we are granted vouchers— I know. Margaret stopped. In the window-gray light, she looked older than she had a year ago. There were lines around her mouth that had deepened over the winter. Her hands, folded neatly in her lap, showed the work they had quietly taken on since the staff reductions. The slight roughness, the small scar on her left index finger from the kitchen. Clara looked at those hands and felt the argument go out of her like a fire losing its air. This is not about you, she told herself. It never was. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Her mother turned to look at her, surprised perhaps by the gentleness, or by the lack of a following, but— I will be well behaved, Clara said. I will attend the assemblies and the dinner parties, and I will wear the appropriate gowns, and I will make polite conversation with appropriate men. She paused. I will not, however, pretend to be stupid. I want that on record. Margaret Whitmore permitted herself a very small, very precise smile. Noted, she said, though perhaps we might negotiate the frequency with which you demonstrate your intelligence. The Hargrove townhouse on Cavendish Square was everything Whitmore Grange was not. Freshly painted, perfectly proportioned, humming with the efficient industry of a full, well-paid staff. Lady Hargrove herself met them at the door, a broad, warm woman in her 50s who embraced Margaret with the genuine affection of an old friendship and surveyed Clara with the practiced eye of someone who had launched 3 daughters of her own into London society. Well, Lady Hargrove said, taking Clara's hands and turning her very slightly in the entryway light, as one might examine a promising stone. You have your father's eyes. That will cause considerable trouble. That seems to be the plan, Clara said. Lady Hargrove laughed. It was a real laugh, unperformed, which immediately made Clara revise her opinion of the woman upward. Sharp tongue, Lady Hargrove said. We'll have to work on that. London has very specific ideas about wit in women. It is permitted, but only if it's gentle enough that men can pretend it was accidental. She smiled. A skill worth cultivating. Or not, Clara said. Lady Hargrove looked at her for a moment. Then she laughed again and led them inside. The first week was reconnaissance, which was how Clara chose to think about it, because thinking about it as shopping herself made something in her chest go very cold and very still. There were morning calls to make and receive. There were introductions to Lady This and the Honorable Miss That, and Mrs. So-and-so who was cousin to the Marquis of Somewhere. Delivered with the particular London velocity that assumed familiarity was the same thing as connection. There were dress fittings and hair discussions and long, strategic conversations between her mother and Lady Hargrove that Clara was not invited to but could hear perfectly well through the parlor door. She needs a strong match, Margaret said, her voice flat with the practicality of necessity. Not a title, necessarily. Income is the priority. The estate cannot— I understand, Lady Hargrove, quieter. Leave the strategy to me, Margaret. I know who is in the market this season. In the market, as though it were a livestock exchange. Clara moved away from the door before she could hear herself described further. The assembly rooms were worse than she had imagined, which was saying something, because her imagination had been fairly vivid. Her first real event was an evening assembly at the home of a Mrs. Alderton on Portman Square. Not a grand ball, Lady Hargrove explained, but a comfortable gathering that would allow Clara to find her footing before the larger season events began. 50 or so guests, music, cards in the side room, dancing if the numbers allowed. Clara wore the deep blue silk that had been refashioned from one of her mother's older gowns. Hargrove's seamstress had worked magic, and it fit well, though the fabric still carried the faint ghost of something that had belonged to someone else's life. She stood near the window for the first half hour, watching. London society, she decided, operated on an economy of attention. Everyone in the room was simultaneously performing and observing, performing the correct level of ease, the correct amount of interest, the correct degree of availability. Every smile was calibrated, every glance measured. It was exhausting to watch, and she was only a spectator. "You look," said a voice to her left, "like a scientist observing an ant colony." Clara turned. The woman beside her was perhaps 40, dark-haired, with the kind of angular beauty that came from good bones and confidence rather than conventional prettiness. Her gown was expensive without being demonstrative. She was watching the room with an expression that matched, Clara realized, her own. "Is it that obvious?" Clara asked. "Only to someone doing the same thing," the woman said. She extended a hand. "Vivian Ashworth. I am here because my husband made me come, and I am surviving by observing the social rituals of our species from a position of critical distance. You are Clara Whitmore. I am here because the alternative was watching my family's house fall down around our ears while I did nothing." Vivian Ashworth tilted her head. "Honest, dangerous quality in a debutante. So I've been told." "Stick close to me tonight," Vivian said, turning back to the room. "I know everyone in this room, and I like approximately 4 of them, but I'll tell you which ones are actually worth knowing. Consider it a service to a fellow scientist." Clara felt something in her chest ease slightly, the first genuine thing she had encountered since arriving in London. "Gratefully accepted," she said. It was Vivian, 20 minutes later, who went still. They were standing near the card-room entrance, and Vivian's commentary on the assembled guests had been a quiet, precise masterwork of observation. That man has been married twice and is shopping for a third. That woman's smile is genuine, but her husband's is not. Those 2 young men are competing for the same girl, and neither has noticed she's interested in someone else entirely. When the room shifted. It was subtle, the kind of shift that Clara might have missed if she had not been watching so carefully. A fractional realignment of attention, heads turning without appearing to turn, conversations continuing while eyes drifted sideways. "Ah," said Vivian, very quietly. "He came after all." "Who?" Clara asked, though she had already begun to look. He was tall. That was the first thing. He had the height that made a room adjust around him, people unconsciously creating space without being asked. He moved through the gathering with the ease of someone who had never once in his life considered whether he was welcome somewhere because the question had simply never applied. Dark-haired, broad-shouldered, dressed with the effortless precision of a man who wore good clothes the way other people wore skin, without thinking about them. His face was what you remembered, though. Strong angles, a mouth set in a line that suggested it smiled rarely and with deliberate intent, and eyes that were, even from across the room, startlingly alert. He was scanning the gathering with the same systematic attention Clara had been applying, but where she felt like an observer, he moved like a proprietor, like a man surveying territory he already owned. "Adrian Blackthorne," Vivian said, "Duke of Ravenmoor. And before you ask, yes, to everything you're thinking." "I wasn't thinking anything specific," Clara said. "You were thinking powerful, dangerous, probably as charming as he is beautiful, and almost certainly a man to be avoided." Vivian sipped her champagne. "You were correct on all counts. He's been London's most sought-after bachelor for 6 consecutive seasons, which he has survived by expressing mild interest in approximately 30 women and making commitments to precisely none of them. He is wealthy beyond any practical requirement, titled beyond any practical necessity, and possessed of a reputation that mothers in this room whisper about both with warning and with shameless hope." "Which category does your whisper fall into?" Clara asked. "Observation," Vivian said. "Pure observation. I knew his mother. She was a remarkable woman." A pause. "He does not speak of her." Clara looked at the Duke again. He had been greeted by their host, had exchanged pleasantries with 2 men near the fireplace, and was now, with the unhurried inevitability of a tide, making his way through the room. "He's coming this way," Clara said. "He is," Vivian agreed. "He's seen you." He can't have... Clara. Vivian's voice was dry and certain. He saw you the moment he walked in. Men like Adrian Blackthorne always see exactly what they intend to see. He stopped 3 feet away. Up close, the intelligence in his face was even more apparent and more unsettling. His eyes moved from Vivian to Clara with a precision that felt less like attraction and more like assessment. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the voice of a man who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "I was told you'd sworn off these gatherings entirely." "My husband disagrees with my social retirement," Vivian said pleasantly. "Your Grace, may I present Miss Clara Whitmore? She is newly arrived in London for the season." The Duke turned the full weight of his attention to Clara. It was, she would think later, like being examined by something both beautiful and predatory, the kind of creature that was magnificent precisely because it had never been required to doubt itself. She met his gaze directly and waited. He was, she could see, not accustomed to being waited out. "Miss Whitmore," he said, after the beat that had been long enough to be deliberate. "I don't believe I know the name." "I don't believe there's any reason you should," Clara said. "We've never met." Something crossed his face. Very briefly, very quickly. Not offense. Something more like interest, the slight quickening of a man who had expected one thing and received another. "Dorset, if I'm not mistaken," he said. "Your accent carries just a trace of it." "You have a good ear. I make it a point to listen carefully." He glanced toward the dancing, where a country reel was being assembled with cheerful chaos. "Are you engaged for the next set, Miss Whitmore?" Clara looked at the dance floor. She looked back at him. She knew what yes meant. She knew what yes to the Duke of Ravenmoor meant in this room, in this company, in the language of the London season. It meant notice. It meant status. It meant that tomorrow morning, at every breakfast table where this gathering's attendees sat down, her name would be spoken. She knew what her mother would say. She knew what Lady Hargrove would say. She knew, with cold mathematical clarity, what the practical, sensible, family-saving answer was. "I am not engaged," she said, "but I have a condition." The Duke blinked. It was a very small blink, barely perceptible, but Clara caught it. "A condition," he repeated. "I don't make pleasant conversation for its own sake," she said. "If we dance, I'll talk to you as though you're a person and expect the same courtesy. If that seems like too much work, I quite understand. There are several young women near the fireplace who I believe would be delighted to speak about absolutely nothing for the duration of a reel." The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Adrian Blackthorne smiled. It was not the practiced social smile Clara had watched him deploy across the room. It reached further than that. Something in it surprised, something in it genuine, something in it that she instinctively understood he did not show often. "That," he said, "is the first interesting thing anyone has said to me tonight." He extended his hand. After a moment, Clara took it. Yeah, they danced. It was a country reel. Energetic, structured, the kind of dance that required attention to the pattern and allowed for conversation only in the brief pauses when partners came together before separating again. Clara had danced country reels since she was 9 years old, in the kitchen of Whitmore Grange with the housekeeper calling the steps. She was good at it. She did not watch her feet. Adrian Blackthorne, she discovered, was also good at it, and also did not watch his feet. He watched her instead, with a focused, concentrated attention that she noticed and chose deliberately not to respond to. "You find London disagreeable," he said, during the first pause. A statement, not a question. "I find London impressive and exhausting," she replied. "Both can be true." They separated, turned, rejoined. "You've been here less than a week," he said. "How do you know how long I've been here?" A slight smile. "Mrs. Ashworth would have mentioned you before now if you had been." "You speak to Mrs. Ashworth regularly?" "She is one of perhaps 6 people in London whose opinion I respect." They separated again. Clara used the bar of music to think quickly about what she wanted to say and what she didn't. "Why are you here tonight?" she asked when they came back together. "I was told this is a modest gathering. It seems below your usual orbit." "You were told about my usual orbit." "Mrs. Ashworth is thorough. He turned them neatly at the corner of the pattern. "I came," he said, "because I was curious." "About?" "Unspecified," he said, and left it there. Clara looked at him. He looked back. The dance moved them apart again, and when they came together for the last figure, she said, "That is a very unsatisfying answer." "Most honest answers are," he said. The music ended. He bowed. She curtsied. Around them, the room reassembled its attention. She could feel it, the slight refocusing, the renewed whisper current. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Whitmore," he said. "You were right, incidentally." "About what?" "About pleasant conversation." His eyes held something wry, and she thought entirely real. This was considerably better. He left. And Clara stood very still for a moment in the middle of the floor, listening to her own heartbeat, which was, she noted, with something between irritation and alarm, moving at a pace that had nothing to do with the exertion of a country reel. "Well," said Vivian Ashworth, appearing at her elbow with the timing of a woman who had been watching everything. "Don't," Clara said. "I haven't said anything." "You were about to." Vivian sipped her champagne. "I was going to say that in 6 seasons, I have never once seen Adrian Blackthorne argue for a dance. He usually waits for them to come to him." "He didn't argue," Clara said. "I set a condition." "And he accepted it." Vivian looked across the room to where the Duke had rejoined a group near the fireplace. As though sensing the attention, he glanced back. Not at Vivian, at Clara. "That," Vivian said softly, "is either very interesting or very dangerous." Clara watched the Duke turn back to his conversation. "Possibly both," she said. That night, in the small, well-appointed guest room on the second floor of the Hargrove townhouse, Clara sat at the dressing table and looked at her own reflection for a long time. She had a plan. She had always operated better with a plan. It was one of the things her father had taught her, along with the principles of household accounting and the novels of Jane Austen and How to Read a Property Lease and why it mattered that you understood the terms of any agreement before you signed it. The plan was this: survive the season. Make herself agreeable without making herself a fool. Find a man of moderate means and moderate character who would agree to a partnership of mutual respect and reasonable coexistence, secure enough to protect the Grange, undemanding enough to allow her some portion of the life she actually wanted. Not love. Love was not in the plan because love required vulnerability, and vulnerability was a luxury for people whose families did not have failing roofs and 2 years of debt standing between them and ruin. The plan was sensible. The plan was practical. The plan was everything her father's daughter, raised on argument and clarity, should have been able to execute without difficulty. She looked at her reflection. She thought about eyes that had been startlingly alert, about a smile that had surprised her by reaching further than she expected. Stop it, she told herself. She was very good at not saying things aloud. She was considerably less good, it turned out, at stopping herself from thinking them. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in London social warfare, conducted at the pace of a very elegant, very exhausting chess game. There were balls, the larger, grander affairs that the season was famous for, held in the ballrooms of houses so vast they seemed designed less for living than for spectacle. There were Almack's assemblies, for which Lady Hargrove had indeed procured vouchers through the influence she had promised, and which Clara attended with the focused energy of someone completing a difficult assignment. There were morning rides in Hyde Park, afternoon calls, evening concerts, a steady, relentless current of social performance that she was learning to navigate the way you learned any difficult terrain, by paying attention to what was beneath the surface. She was good at it. This surprised her. She had expected to be miserable and obvious in her misery. The country girl in the London rooms, graceless, overwhelmed. Instead, she found that the same qualities that had made her difficult at home, the directness, the habit of observation, the refusal to perform emotions she did not feel, translated in London to something that read, in the right company, as remarkable. "You have," Lady Hargrove told her one morning, with what sounded like genuine approval, "the gift of making people feel that you are actually listening to them. Do you know how rare that is?" "I am actually listening to them," Clara said. "Yes," Lady Hargrove said, nodding slowly. That's why it works. There were interested men. She catalogued them without particular enthusiasm. Lord Fenwick, 40, twice widowed, kind in manner, and cautious in speech, who owned land in Shropshire. Mr. Edward Cahill, younger, 27, second son of a baronet with a respectable income from trade that he was slightly apologetic about, which she found endearing. Sir Thomas Hale, who was everything her mother would approve of, and who made Clara feel, in his company, the way she imagined it would feel to stand in a room where all the windows had been closed. She was cordial to all of them. She danced when asked. She made conversation, real conversation, not the performed variety. And Adrian Blackthorne appeared, everywhere. Not conspicuously. He was not following her. Or if he was, he did it with a subtlety that prevented it from being anything she could name or object to. He was simply, repeatedly, present. At the Cavendish ball, he arrived when she was in conversation with Vivian and remained in her peripheral vision for the better part of an hour before they were introduced by circumstance into the same discussion circle. He had opinions about the political situation with railway expansion that were informed and specific, and he listened to her counter-argument with an attentiveness that she found both gratifying and dangerous. At the Beaumont concert, he sat 2 rows behind her and afterwards sought her out during the interval to argue, politely, but with evident real conviction, that the second movement had been taken at entirely the wrong tempo. "You have strong opinions about music," Clara said. "I have strong opinions about most things," he said. "I simply pick my battles. And this is a battle worth picking?" He looked at her. Something in the look was direct in a way that made the question feel like it was about more than music. "Some things," he said, "are worth being precise about." At Almack's, he danced with her for the second time. The waltz. Her mother watched from the side of the room with an expression that Clara could not entirely read, something between hope and warning. He was a better waltzer than she expected, which was to say he was excellent, which she should have expected but hadn't, because she kept making the mistake of expecting him to be slightly less than he appeared, and he kept declining to cooperate with this expectation. "You're very quiet tonight," he said halfway through the dance. "I'm thinking," she said. "About what?" "About whether I should be doing this." "Dancing." "Talking to you repeatedly." She met his eyes. "People notice." "People always notice," he said easily. "That's their primary occupation." "It matters more for some of us than for others," she said. It came out more pointed than she intended. He was quiet for a moment. The waltz carried them through a turn. "You mean," he said slowly, "that your circumstances require a careful reputation, and being associated with mine is a complication." It was so directly said that she was momentarily caught off balance. "I mean," she said, recovering, "that I am here for a specific purpose, and it does not involve becoming the subject of London's gossip for sport." "And you think that's what this is," he said. "Sport." "I think," Clara said carefully, "that you are a man who is accustomed to winning, and that what you find interesting about me is primarily that I am not immediately compliant." The silence that followed was not the usual silence of their conversations, the comfortable, contested silences of 2 people measuring each other. This was different, tighter. "That is a very honest assessment," he said finally. "You said you valued honesty." "I did." His hand at her waist was entirely proper, entirely light. "You may be partially right." "Only partially?" "I'm still determining," he said, "the rest." The waltz ended. He led her back to her mother with perfect correctness, bowed, and walked away. And Clara stood with her hands folded and her face composed in thought, with the cold clarity of someone who had grown up making hard calculations. He is the most dangerous thing in this room, and the problem is that you know it, and it still does not seem to be enough. 3 nights later, she found out why he had left London the previous spring. It wasn't Vivian who told her. It was a conversation she had not been meant to overhear. 2 women in the retiring room at a dinner party on Grosvenor Street, voices lowered to the particular pitch that carried clearly when the surrounding noise dropped. "The business with the Lawton girl," one was saying. "Last April. He was paying her attention all through March, and everyone expected a proposal. And then overnight he simply stopped. And she? the other voice asked. Went home to the country, very quietly. The family didn't say anything, but everyone knows. And Blackthorn? Blackthorn never said a word. Went back to his estate for 3 months. Came back in July as though nothing had happened. Nobody dared ask him. A pause. They say there was another woman involved, before the Lawton girl. A widow. Very beautiful, very persuasive. Some say she still has a hold over him. The voices moved away. Clara finished adjusting her glove in the mirror and looked at her own face. A pattern, she thought. Sustained attention, then withdrawal. The woman left behind. She thought about the alert eyes and the careful honesty and the smile that had reached further than she expected. She thought, I know what I'm looking at. I have always known what I'm looking at. She thought, knowing what something is does not make it safe. She went back to the dinner. She was, as always, perfectly composed. As always, it cost her something. Timk. The conversation she did not expect happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the most unremarkable setting possible. The lending library on Bond Street, where she had gone alone, Lady Hargrove's footman waiting outside, to return 3 books and find 3 more, which was the kind of errand she had been conducting independently since she was 14 years old and was not prepared to renegotiate simply because she was in London now. She was on the 2nd level, in the section devoted to natural philosophy, when she heard him below. Not speaking to her, speaking to the librarian, a thin, nervous young man, in a voice so quiet she almost missed it. The account, he was saying. I'd like it settled before Friday. And discreetly. The family doesn't need to know the source. A pause. The librarian murmuring something. Just make sure the children have what they need through the winter, the Duke said. The rest is your judgment. She heard the sound of something. Papers, perhaps, being exchanged, then quiet steps moving away. Clara stood very still among the natural philosophy volumes. She waited until she heard him reach the stairs, and then she moved to the railing and looked down. He was adjusting his gloves. He glanced up, whether by instinct or attention she couldn't say, and saw her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Miss Whitmore, he said. Not surprised exactly. Not performing the unsurprise either, just present in the way he always was, stripped of the social layer. Your Grace, she said. Another moment of quiet. Natural philosophy? He asked, nodding at the section behind her. I find, she said carefully, that it is useful to understand how things actually work, rather than simply how they are supposed to work. He held her gaze. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not quite vulnerability, because she doubted he permitted that, but a kind of careful openness, as though he had been caught at something and had made the decision, in the half-second available, not to deny it. Yes, he said, it generally is. He nodded once, replaced his hat, and walked out. Clara looked at the place where he had been standing. She thought about what Vivian had said the night they met. He does not speak of her. His mother. A remarkable woman. She thought about a man who settled anonymous accounts for families he had no obligation to, who moved through his own reputation as though it were a weather system he had decided not to argue with, who looked at her in a lending library on a Tuesday afternoon with the expression of someone briefly, carefully visible. She found her 3 books. She did not find quite the equilibrium she had arrived with. Outside, the footman was waiting. The London fog had lifted for once, and the afternoon light fell clean and sharp on the stones of Bond Street. Clara walked home through it thinking about trust, what it required, what it cost, what happened to people who extended it to the wrong person. She thought about Whitmore Grange and the roof and the 2 years. She thought about her father's library and the arguments that had been a form of love. She did not think about the Duke's hands adjusting his gloves in the library, or the quiet way he had said the family doesn't need to know the source. She tried very hard not to think about that. She was not entirely successful. That night, she wrote a letter to her father. She did this sometimes, still. Sat down with paper and her best pen, and wrote as though he were alive to receive it, because there were things she needed to say somewhere other than the inside of her own head. She never sent them. She kept them in the back of the small journal she had brought from Dorset, tucked behind the last page. "Father," she wrote, "London is what you would have expected and also not. The social machinery is exactly as described in every novel you ever put in my hands, and I suspect that was intentional on your part. I am navigating it as well as can be expected. I have met a man." She paused, put down the pen, picked it up again. "I have met a man who is nothing like what he appears to be. Or perhaps he is exactly what he appears to be, and what he appears to be is simply more than anyone has bothered to notice. I'm not certain yet. What I'm certain of is that I made a plan before I came here, and the plan was sensible, and the plan is still the correct plan for all the right reasons. I'm telling you about the man because I need someone to know, and you are the only person I have ever been able to tell anything to without editing myself first. The plan remains unchanged. I hope you know that I understand why you didn't tell us about the debts. I hope you know I'm not angry. I hope you know I'm doing this for the house and for Mother, and because I love you both, and that it is not the same as doing it against myself. I hope that's true." She stopped writing. Outside the window, London breathed its gray, enormous breath. Somewhere in this city, in a house she had never seen, the Duke of Ravenmoor was doing whatever dukes did in the evenings, managing his impossible reputation, or reading, or perhaps sitting in a room that was too large and too quiet, in the way that houses become when the people who should be in them are gone. She folded the letter, tucked it in the journal, blew out the candle. In the dark, she lay on her back and listened to the city, and told herself that the sound of her own heart was the sound of someone who had things firmly in hand. She almost believed it. The season had only just begun, and the most dangerous games are always the ones where you don't realize you've started playing until you're already in too deep to walk away. The morning after the lending library, Clara made a decision. She would stop analyzing him. It was the only rational course. She had cataloged the evidence, the anonymous charity, the quiet intensity, the smile that arrived without warning and meant more than it should. And she had reached the only conclusion a sensible person could reach, which was that Adrian Blackthorne was a complicated man in a world that did not reward women who became entangled with complicated men. The accounting was clear. The risk was documented. The verdict was obvious. She would stop thinking about him. She managed this successfully for approximately 4 days. On the 5th day, he appeared at a morning ride in Hyde Park, mounted on a dark gray horse that moved with the same unhurried authority as its rider, and fell into pace beside her before she had formed a single objection. "Miss Whitmore," he said. The morning light was thin and cool, the park still quiet at this hour, the row largely empty of the later crowd that would fill it in an hour. "You've changed your route." "I prefer the eastern path," she said. "Fewer people." "And fewer people means less performance required." She glanced at him. "You noticed." "You do it very well," he said, without particular flattery in the words. "The performance. But it costs something. You can see it if you know how to look." "And you know how to look." "I've had considerable practice reading rooms," he said. Something in the phrasing was dry, but underneath it was something she recognized. The faint edge of a person describing experience that was not entirely pleasant. They rode in silence for a moment. The trees on either side were newly leafed, the green so fresh it was almost aggressive, the way spring in England could be, sudden and insistent, as though apologizing for the gray months before it. "You've been avoiding the larger assemblies," he said. "I've been selective," she said. "There's a difference." "The difference being?" "Avoiding implies retreat. I don't retreat." He made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but was related to one. "No," he said. "I don't imagine you do." The path curved, and for a moment they were riding toward the light rather than across it, and Clara had the sudden, unwelcome awareness that she was entirely comfortable. Not performed comfortable, not managed comfortable, actually comfortable, the way she was in her father's library or walking the fields at Whitmore Grange. The kind of ease that arrived without effort and was therefore, she reminded herself sharply, the most dangerous kind. "Why are you here?" she asked. Direct. The way she always returned to direct when she felt herself drifting. He considered the question with a seriousness that she had come to realize was characteristic. He did not deflect questions he found worth answering. "I wanted to see how you were," he said, "without an audience." That is either very considerate or very strategic. It can be both, he said, though in this case I'll allow that it is primarily the former. Clara looked at the path ahead. The Lawton girl, she said. The silence that followed was different from their usual silences. It had weight. You've heard, he said. This is London, she said. Everyone has heard. The question is whether you'll tell me the version that isn't the version being told in the retiring rooms of Grosvenor Street dinner parties. The pause lasted the length of a full breath. Miss Whitmore, he said finally, there are things in my history that I will answer for honestly, when the time and the context are right. The Lawton matter is not what it has been described as. A pause. I won't ask you to simply believe that. I would only ask that you consider the quality of the source before treating gossip as documentation. It was a careful answer, not evasive. He had leaned toward the question rather than away from it, but careful. Fair enough, she said. He looked at her. That's all? You gave me an honest response to an uncomfortable question, she said. I'm not in the habit of punishing honesty. Something in his expression shifted, very slightly. She had the distinct impression that people did not often say that to him. They rode the rest of the eastern path in a silence that was not uncomfortable, and when the route brought them back toward the park's main gate, he excused himself with a correctness that gave her nothing to object to and everything to think about. She thought about it for the rest of the day. She did not write to her father about it that night. She told herself that was because there was nothing significant enough to report. She told herself that. The assault, when it came from the direction she had least expected, not from society's whispers about the Duke. Not from her mother's increasingly pointed inquiries about Lord Fenwick's prospects or Mr. Cahill's income, not from the exhaustion of the season's relentless machinery. It came from a woman named Lady Dorothea Price. Lady Price was 53 years old, a widow of considerable fortune, a fixture of London society for 30 years, and possessed of the particular kind of social power that comes from outlasting everyone who might have checked it. She was not cruel in the obvious way. She didn't shout or demean in public. Her weapon was the aside. The perfectly timed, perfectly audible remark delivered to a companion while the target was close enough to hear but not close enough to formally respond. Clara had encountered her twice before without incident. The third time at the Alderton Musicale, a larger, more consequential gathering than the earlier assembly, attended by several of the season's most significant hostesses, changed the dynamic entirely. She had been standing with Vivian during the interval, discussing the soprano's remarkable upper register when she heard it. Whitmore girl. Lady Price's voice, directed at the woman beside her, perfectly calibrated for carrying. The one Blackthorne has been amusing himself with. Clara did not visibly react. Beside her, Vivian went very still. She's tolerable looking, I suppose, Lady Price continued, in that raw country way. Speaks rather too much. You can always tell the ones who weren't properly finished. They mistake having opinions for having consequence. Her family, the companion murmured. Bankrupt gentility. The father died and left nothing but the name. She's here to sell that name, and she's set her sights high. A pause, precisely weighted. Too high for what she is. Blackthorne will tire of the novelty in another week, and she'll go back to Dorset without even a good story to show for it. These girls always do. Clara set her glass of punch down on the nearest table. Very carefully, very precisely. Vivian's hand found her arm. Light, warning pressure. Clara, Vivian said quietly, she's baiting you. She does this. If you respond, she wins. I know, Clara said. The correct response is silence and departure. I know that too, Clara said. She picked up her glass of punch again. She turned. She walked with steady, unhurried steps, the 6 feet to where Lady Price was standing. Lady Price looked up. A flicker of something to surprise quickly reorganized into amused contempt. Miss Whitmore, she said, with the condescension of someone who has never once doubted their right to occupy any room they enter. Lady Price, Clara said. Her voice was entirely pleasant. I apologize for interrupting. I wanted to say directly, since I gather you prefer to speak almost directly, that you are correct on several points. Lady Price blinked. My family's finances are reduced, Clara continued. I am here for the season with a specific practical purpose. I was not, as you suggest, finished in the London fashion. I was educated by a man who believed that thinking clearly was worth more than performing correctly. She paused. I suspect we might simply disagree on that point. The room around them had developed the particular quality of a space in which people are trying to appear not to be listening while listening with their entire bodies. However, Clara said, still pleasant, still perfectly measured, I'd prefer you say these things to my face rather than 3 feet from my ear while addressing someone else. If you have opinions about my worth, my prospects, or my family, I am entirely capable of hearing them directly and responding in kind. A slight smile. I find it more efficient. Lady Price stared at her. The silence lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then Clara nodded, the nod of someone concluding a perfectly ordinary conversation, and walked back to Vivian. Vivian stared at her. I told you to choose silence, Vivian said. I know, Clara said, and sipped her punch. That was extraordinarily inadvisable. Probably. She will make your life very difficult for the rest of this season. She was going to anyway, Clara said. At least now she'll do it to my face. Vivian looked at her for a long, measuring moment. Then she did something Clara had not quite seen her do before. She raised her glass, very slightly, in a small private toast. Your father, Vivian said, sounds like he was a remarkable man. Clara felt the familiar ache of it, quick, sharp, already learning to coexist with the rest of her. He was, she said. He would have found all of this enormously entertaining. The consequences arrived on schedule. Within 3 days, Clara noticed the shift. It was not dramatic. London society rarely operated dramatically when it could be effective quietly. But the morning calls that had been becoming regular stopped coming. 2 invitations that Lady Hargrove had been confident of did not materialize. At the next Almack's assembly, a cluster of women near the refreshment table watched her arrival with the particular attentiveness of people who had been briefed. Lady Price has spoken to Mrs. Alderton, Lady Hargrove told her mother, in a conversation Clara was, once again, not invited to and could hear perfectly well from the hallway. And to Lady Beaumont, she's framing the girl as a pause. Ungovernable, common pretension in a genteel frame. What does that mean for the vouchers? Margaret's voice, steady, working hard to stay steady. It means we need to be careful, Lady Hargrove said. It means the next 4 weeks matter enormously. One misstep and we lose ground we cannot recover. Clara stood in the hallway and looked at her own hands. Ungovernable, she thought, as though the ability to answer for yourself was a character flaw. She thought about the Grange, the roof, Mr. Farrow's if. She went back to her room and did not confront anyone. Being strategic was, she was learning, a different skill than being brave. Harder, in some ways. It was Vivian who told her, a week after the Price confrontation, about the charity school. They were walking in the park, a habit they had developed together, finding in each other a companionship that required neither performance nor management. When Vivian said, with the conversational ease of someone dropping something important into unremarkable syntax, "Did you know Blackthorn funds a school in Southwark?" Clara kept walking. I didn't. Neither does most of London. Vivian's tone was careful, informing, not editorializing. He established it 3 years ago through an intermediary, so the connection wasn't traceable to him. 40 children, a teacher, and 2 assistants. The building needed a new roof last autumn, and he covered it inside a week without telling anyone. Clara thought of a thin, nervous librarian receiving quiet instructions. The family doesn't need to know the source. Why doesn't he tell anyone? She asked. Because, Vivian said, if he told anyone, it would change what it was. It would become part of the performance. The reformed rake demonstrates charity for public approval. She paused. He doesn't do it for approval. That's the difference. They walked in silence for a moment. Why are you telling me this? Clara asked. Vivian was quiet long enough that the silence was its own kind of answer. Because, she said finally, I knew his mother. and because she spent 20 years managing a reputation that was not her own making and sacrificing the things she actually wanted for the sake of appearances. And because Adrian has been doing the same thing since he was 19 years old, and I would very much prefer that he stop. She glanced at Clara. You are the first person in 6 years who has spoken to him as though his reputation is not the whole of him. Clara looked at the path ahead. Vivian, I have a plan. I know about your plan. The plan doesn't include— I know what the plan doesn't include, Vivian said. I'm not asking you to abandon your plan. I'm asking you to consider whether the plan might be wrong about what you can and cannot afford. It was, Clara thought, possibly the most devastating thing anyone had said to her since she arrived in London. She had no answer for it. In the afternoon, she spent 3 hours reviewing household accounts with her mother, going over figures she had largely memorized already, clarified certain things. The picture had not improved. The Grange's situation, cross-checked against the letter from Mr. Farrow that had arrived last week, was precisely what it had been, possibly marginally worse, given a failed portion of the spring crops and the additional costs of the season itself. Lord Fenwick was still the most practical option, though he had not yet made a formal approach. Mr. Cahill had been less present recently, which might mean a rival interest or might simply be timidity. And there was the separate matter of the tenants. She had not mentioned this to her mother because she was not entirely sure what to do with it, but a letter from their remaining housekeeper at the Grange, a woman named Mrs. Bates, who had been with the family for 20 years, and who wrote letters with the directness of someone who did not consider it her job to soften difficult news, had mentioned that the Harlow family, who farmed the eastern parcel, had lost their second child to the fever going through the village, and that their eldest son had broken his leg and could not work the full season. 2 acres of the eastern parcel would go unfulfilled. The Grange would bear that loss. Clara folded the letter and put it in her journal next to the ones to her father. She thought about what Adrian had done in the library, and what Vivian had said about the school in Southwark, and she held it up against the Harlow family's broken son and the 2 unfulfilled acres, and she thought, this is what land means. This is what it has always meant. People whose lives depend on whether the person above them in the chain is paying attention. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her by how quiet it was, how free of drama. He pays attention. She did not examine that thought too closely. She put it with the letter and closed the journal. Bah. The encounter at Lord Beaumont's ball was not something she planned or orchestrated. It was the largest event she had attended since arriving in London. The full social machinery in operation. 300 guests, a ballroom that occupied the entire eastern wing of a house so large it had its own internal geography, a supper that would not begin until midnight. Lady Hargrove had spent the preceding 48 hours managing preparations for their attendance with the focused energy of a general managing a campaign, which in some respects it was. Clara wore cream and deep gold. Her mother had spent the morning with her hair, and the result was, she admitted to herself in the glass, genuinely good. Vivian, arriving in the carriage with them, looked at her and said simply, formidable. It was the highest compliment Vivian gave. She danced 3 sets in the first hour. Lord Fenwick asked her for the second, and they made conversation with the comfortable, slightly effortful rhythm of 2 people who respected each other without quite connecting, which was what it always was with him. He was kind. He was entirely appropriate. She caught herself, midway through the 3rd figure, thinking about intelligent eyes and arguments about concert tempos, and brought herself back with something close to force. Focus, she told herself. This is what the plan looks like. This right here. Fenwick returned her to her mother with every courtesy. Her mother looked at him retreating and then looked at Clara with an expression that asked a question. He is very kind, Clara said. He is, her mother agreed. A pause. Is that enough? Clara looked at her. Her mother, who had managed the quiet diminishment of their life over the last 3 years without complaint, who had altered her own hems and dismissed her own staff, and made a plan for her daughter's future because the alternatives were worse. Her mother was asking and meaning it, and that meant something. I don't know yet, Clara said. Her mother nodded once. Then you should find out, one way or the other, before this season ends. It was the most direct thing her mother had said to her since they had left Dorset. She found Vivian near the eastern windows, and they stood together watching the room, and Vivian said without looking at her, "He's been watching you all evening." Clara did not ask who. "Second pillar from the left," Vivian said, "since you arrived." Clara did not look. "He watches everyone. It's his primary mode of operation." "He watches the room," Vivian said. "He watches you." And then, because the evening had apparently decided to arrange itself without consulting her, Adrian Blackthorne appeared beside them. He addressed Vivian first. That was his habit, she had noticed, the small courtesy of acknowledging the relationship that predated his interest, never ignoring intermediaries for the sake of directness. It was one of the things that complicated the simple version of him she tried to maintain. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said. Then to Clara, "Miss Whitmore." "You look—" "Don't," Clara said. He paused. "I was going to say formidable." She glanced at Vivian, who had the expression of someone who is carefully not smiling. "Fine," Clara said. "I came to ask if you were free for the supper dance," he said, "which is in 20 minutes, and which I am asking now because I understand you prefer not to be ambushed." "How do you know I prefer not to be ambushed?" "You told me that the first night," he said. "You said you don't make pleasant conversation for its own sake and expect the same courtesy. It seemed like a person who prefers time to think over being caught unprepared." He remembered that. Word for word, she was fairly certain. "Yes," she said, "that is an accurate reading." "Then, the supper dance?" She was about to say something measured and appropriate about considering it, when from the far side of the room she heard, with the carrying clarity of Lady Price's particularly practiced projection, the words, "Bold of her, dancing with Blackthorne again." One starts to wonder if the Whitmore girl is attempting an entirely different category of ambition than she lets on. The room's nearest cluster of conversation dipped. The words had landed where they were meant to land. Clara felt the heat of it. Not embarrassment, but something sharper, something that knew the precise damage those words could do and resented the helplessness of having no clean countermove. She could not respond. Responding to Lady Price again would confirm the narrative that she was ungovernable. She could not ignore it because the people nearest her had heard it and were watching for her reaction. She could not. "Miss Whitmore," Adrian said. She looked at him. He had heard it too. She could see in his face that he had heard it and that he understood exactly what it meant for her. His expression had not changed. He was too controlled for that. But something in his eyes had sharpened to a very fine, very cold point. "The supper dance," he said again. Not differently. The same words, the same tone, the same unhurried certainty. As though Lady Price had not spoken. As though the cluster of listening faces around them were a weather condition rather than an audience. She understood what he was offering, not rescue. He was too careful to insult her with rescue. He was offering the one thing that cost Lady Price her weapon. The appearance that the words had not landed, that Clara Whitmore was not rattled, that she was, in this room, exactly as consequential as she presented herself. She also understood what accepting meant, what it would look like, what it would mean for the plan and for Lord Fenwick and for the neat, practical calculations she had been maintaining. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." Something crossed his face, something quick and warm and almost instantly controlled. 20 minutes, he said. "I'll come find you." He left. Vivian, beside her, said nothing. "I know," Clara said. "I haven't said anything." "You were about to." "I was going to ask," Vivian said carefully, "whether that yes was entirely strategic." Clara watched Adrian cross the room, watched him resume his conversation near the fireplace with the ease of a man who had just done something complicated and filed it away. He did not look back. "I don't know," Clara said, and meant it. The supper dance was a waltz, which was either coincidence or something someone had arranged, and she chose not to investigate which. They moved through the first minute in silence, the music doing what it always did, taking the room and making it smaller, reducing 300 people to the space of 2 in motion. "Lady Price," she said finally, "how long has she been doing this?" "Doing which particular thing?" "This specific thing. With you. The undertone. The implication." He was quiet for a moment. The waltz carried them through a slow turn. Lady Price and I have a history that is not my proudest chapter, he said. 4 years ago, I was less careful about who I allowed near my household. She was among a set of people whose company I found stimulating and whose influence I did not adequately examine. Another pause. When I ended that association, she found other means of engagement. She uses you as a weapon against other people, Clara said. She uses my reputation, he said. There's a distinction. The reputation is, to a significant extent, one I built, in my younger years, without adequate thought for what it would become. His voice was flat about this, the flatness of someone who has made their accounting with something and decided to carry it rather than excuse it. You built a reputation as a man who collects women and discards them, Clara said. She said it directly because he would notice evasion. Yes, he said. Was it true? It was true, he said, in the way that most reputations are true. It was a version of behavior that became a simplified story. I was careless, and sometimes deliberately so, and I told myself it was simply the way of things. I was wrong. He met her eyes. That's a harder thing to say than it sounds. I know, she said. It's harder to admit wrongness than to defend it. Your father taught you that. He taught me most of the useful things, she said. They moved through the next figure in silence, and it was the most honest silence she had spent in the same room as another person in a very long time. I want to ask you something, she said as they came out of the turn. And I want you to answer me honestly, even if the honest answer is unflattering. All right, he said. What am I to you? She asked. Not in the version you'd give a drawing room, not the polished version, the actual answer. The music continued. He did not answer immediately, and she respected him for that, for taking the question seriously rather than reaching for the nearest comfortable response. You are, he said finally, carefully, the first person I have spoken to in a very long time who responds to what I actually say rather than to the idea of me. A beat. That is rarer than it should be and more valuable than I knew how to recognize until recently. And, she said, because there was more, she could hear the more. He looked at her directly, with that quality she had identified at the lending library, the careful openness of a man who had made a decision about visibility. And I find that I am considerably less interested in the game than I was when it started, he said, which is a new development. The music began its final phrase. I have a plan, Clara said. I want you to know that. I came here with a plan, and the plan has specific requirements, and I have not abandoned it. I know about the plan, he said. She looked at him sharply. How? You mentioned the roof, he said. The first night, you said the alternative to London was watching your family's house fall down. I'm not incapable of arithmetic, Miss Whitmore. And that It does not change anything I said 30 seconds ago, he said. Those are separate questions. The music ended. He held her gaze through the final note. They're not separate questions, she said quietly. They're the same question. That's the problem. He released her hand with the correct formal bow, and she curtsied, and they separated for supper with the 50 feet of proper distance between them and 300 people watching. Clara found her mother, sat beside her, and made conversation with the appropriate level of animation through 7 courses of food she couldn't taste. Her mother, once, put her hand briefly over Clara's under the table. Clara turned her palm up and held it. Sit. It was after supper, near the end of the evening, that she overheard Lord Fenwick. She had stepped into the corridor for a moment of quiet. The evening was wearing on midnight, and the ballroom heat was considerable. And around the corner of the corridor, not visible from where she stood, 2 men were speaking. She recognized Fenwick's voice first. Mild, deliberate, the voice of a man who always thought before he spoke. The Whitmore girl, his companion said. She didn't know the voice. You've been showing interest. She's remarkable, actually, Fenwick said, and the genuineness of it struck her. There was no performance in it, no social construction, just a man saying something true. Intelligent, direct, the kind of woman who would actually run an estate rather than simply occupy one. Blackthorn's been circling her all season. I've noticed, Fenwick said. And? A pause. And I'm not a young man who believes he can compete with the Duke of Ravenmoor on any territory he's chosen to claim. Quiet. Resigned. Not bitter. That was the thing. Just clear-eyed. If she were interested in what I could offer, I believe she would have made it apparent by now. She's not a woman who conceals her thinking effectively. Clara stood very still in the corridor. So you're withdrawing? I'm being realistic, Fenwick said, which is possibly the same thing. The voices moved away. Clara stood alone in the corridor for a very long time. The plan, she thought, had required Fenwick. The plan had been built around exactly the kind of practical, respectable match that Fenwick represented. And Fenwick, she realized, had read the situation with more accuracy than she had been willing to apply. She thought about the plan. She thought about the 2 years and the roof and Mr. Farrow's if. She thought about a waltz and what honesty cost, and a man saying, I find I am considerably less interested in the game than I was when it started. She thought about what she wanted, not what the plan wanted, not what the family needed, what she, Clara Whitmore, 22 years old, raised in a library by a man who believed that argument was a form of love, what she wanted. It was the most dangerous question she had ever asked herself, and for the first time since arriving in London, she did not immediately supply the safe answer. She walked back into the ballroom. She found Vivian. She said nothing about what she had heard, but something had shifted. She could feel it in herself, some tectonic thing, slow and enormous, the kind of movement that doesn't make noise when it happens, but changes the entire landscape by morning. Across the room, Adrian was speaking to someone she didn't know. His profile turned slightly toward her, and as though he felt the attention, he looked up, found her immediately, held her gaze for 1 beat, 2, then returned to his conversation. Just like that. As though she were a fixed point he was orienting from. Clara looked away first, but not quickly enough. And Vivian, beside her, said nothing at all, which was somehow the loudest thing anyone had said to her all evening. She wrote to her father that night, sitting at the small desk in the guest room, the city quiet around her at last, the candle burning low. Father, she wrote, I think the plan is in trouble. Not because it has failed, it hasn't yet, but because I am no longer entirely certain I want it to succeed. That is either the most honest thing I've written to you since you died, or the most foolish. I haven't decided which yet. Tell me what you would say. Tell me what you would say about a man who remembers the exact words you used at a first meeting and uses them back to you weeks later, not to flatter you, but because he was actually listening. Tell me what you would say about a man who built a school in Southwark and told no one. Tell me if wanting a thing and being terrified of it at the same time means you should run toward it or away from it. She stopped writing. She sat in the quiet. Outside, London breathed, enormous, indifferent, containing, somewhere in its gray distances, a man who she was becoming increasingly unable to deny, nothing like what he appeared to be, and exactly like what she had been looking for without knowing she was looking. She did not finish the letter. Some questions, she was learning, could not be answered at a desk in the middle of the night. Some questions could only be answered by the thing that was coming, whatever it was, when it arrived. She blew out the candle. The darkness sat with her for a long time. The darkness did not last. It never did in London. The city had too many early risers, coal deliveries before 5, market carts. The particular percussion of a metropolis that did not fully sleep so much as shift into a quieter gear for a few hours and then crank back up again. By the time pale light was pressing through the gap in the curtains, Clara had been awake for an hour, lying on her back in the gray half-dark, listening to the city reassemble itself below and doing the thing she had been doing since childhood when a problem refused to resolve at night. She was making a list. Not on paper. In her head, where the columns were cleaner. On one side, the plan. Practical, documented, morally defensible. Lord Fenwick, now apparently withdrawn, but there were others. Mr. Cahill had shown renewed interest at last Thursday's gathering. There was a Mr. Hartley she had not yet fully assessed, a widower of 35 with an estate in Wiltshire and no apparent defects beyond a tendency to speak too slowly. The plan could be salvaged. The plan was designed to be salvageable. On the other side, a candle she had blown out too early, a letter she hadn't finished, and the memory of a man finding her across a crowded room with the ease of someone navigating by a fixed star. She got up before the household stirred and went to the small writing desk and looked at the unfinished letter. She read what she had written. Then she folded it, put it in the journal, and made a decision. Not about Adrian. Not yet. And not in the way that the previous night's exhaustion had been pressing her toward. Something smaller and more immediately manageable. She would stop making decisions in the dark. She would stop doing the accounting in the middle of the night when everything cost more than it actually did. She would wait for a clear morning and a clear head, and she would see what she actually thought when she wasn't running on 4 hours of sleep and the echo of a waltz. It was, she thought, possibly the most sensible decision she had made in weeks. It lasted until 10 o'clock, when Vivian arrived at the Hargrove townhouse with her morning call and her characteristic lack of conversational preamble. "Something has happened," Vivian said, the moment they were alone in the small sitting room with the door closed. "I need you to hear it from me before you hear it from someone else." Clara set down her teacup. "Tell me." Last night, after the Beaumont ball, very late, after midnight, Adrian was seen leaving the home of a woman named Helena Voss. The name meant something. Clara searched her memory and found it, one of the whispered names from the retiring room conversation weeks ago. A widow. Very beautiful. Very persuasive. Some say she still has a hold over him. He was seen, Clara said carefully, or he was seen and it was made certain that people would know he was seen. Vivian looked at her with the expression of someone who has been hoping for this exact question. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's the honest answer. What I know is that by this morning it is already being discussed, and the discussion includes your name. Of course it does." "The framing," Vivian said, "is not kind." Clara stood up. She walked to the window. Outside, Cavendish Square was going about its ordinary morning business. A woman with a basket, 2 men in conversation outside the corner house, a cart horse standing in stoic patience, while its driver argued with someone about something that seemed, from this distance, entirely resolvable. "How bad is it?" she asked. "The version being circulated," Vivian said, "is that Blackthorne pursued you publicly throughout the season as a distraction, or worse, as a sport, while maintaining his actual arrangement with Mrs. Voss. That you are the naive country girl who did not understand how the game worked." A pause. "Lady Price has been speaking since early morning." Clara absorbed this. "The damage," Vivian continued, "is not only to your reputation, it's to your prospects. Anyone who was considering an approach will now wait to see how this resolves. And if it resolves badly, it resolves badly," Clara said. "I go home, without a match, without what we came for." She turned from the window. "How long before the narrative hardens?" "A week," Vivian said. "Perhaps less." Clara picked up her teacup again, put it down without drinking. "I need to speak to him," she said. Vivian was quiet for a moment. "That is either the best thing you could do or the worst," she said. "If you seek him out directly, it will be noticed." "Everything is noticed," Clara said. "I've stopped finding that argument useful." She did not seek him out immediately. She was angry, and she had learned from long experience that she made her worst decisions angry. Not explosive decisions, but cold ones. The kind of decisions that felt like clarity, but were actually just hurt wearing precision's clothing. She went for a walk instead. Lady Hargrove's footman following at the correct distance, she walked through Cavendish Square and down toward Oxford Street, and then east, farther than she usually went, into neighborhoods that were less curated, where the season's social geography gave way to something more actual. The streets were louder here, more various, smelling of bread from a bakery, and horse from the stables on the corner, and the Thames from somewhere further south, the muddy mineral smell of a great river doing its patient, indifferent work. She thought about what she knew, not what she had been told, what she actually knew. She knew that Adrian had, for the duration of the season, shown her a consistency of attention and honesty that she had not found in any other person in London outside of Vivienne. She knew that the things she had observed of him directly, the lending library, the way he spoke to servants, the precise and unperformed quality of his conversations with her, did not match the architecture of the man being described this morning. She also knew that she was not a fool. She knew that wanting something to be true was a recognized method of making yourself blind to evidence that it wasn't. She walked for 2 hours. She came back with mud on the hem of her dress and her mind marginally clearer. There was a note waiting. Not from Adrian, from a name she didn't recognize. Miss C. Whitmore. Urgent. Please destroy after reading. V. The handwriting was not Vivian's. It was smaller, less assured, and the paper was plain rather than the good cream stock Vivian used. She took it to her room and read it. Miss Whitmore, I am known to Mrs. Ashworth, who I believe trusts me enough to carry this. I am employed in the household of a woman you may have heard of. I have information regarding certain letters that are being prepared for distribution. These letters concern you directly. I cannot say more in writing. Mrs. Ashworth knows where to find me. Please be careful who you speak to about this. Mr. Clara read it twice. Then she read it a third time, because the second reading had not made it less alarming. She went to find Vivian, Botek. The woman's name was Mary Sutton, and she was a lady's maid, and she was very frightened. Vivian had arranged the meeting at her own house, in the small back parlor that looked out over the kitchen garden. A room, Vivian explained without elaborating, where certain conversations had been held before. Mary Sutton arrived in the plain dress and neat cap of household staff and sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes moving between Vivian and Clara with the careful assessment of someone calculating risk. "You're sure you want to hear this?" she asked, addressing Clara directly. No deference in it, just a real question. "Yes," Clara said. Mary Sutton nodded once and told her. Helena Voss had been, for 3 years, in possession of a set of letters. The letters were not Adrian's. That was the first thing. The thing that had been obscured in every whispered account Clara had heard. They were letters written by a young woman named Eliza Lawton, written in the first months of her introduction to London society. Written to a friend in confidence and obtained by Helena Voss through means that Mary, who had been in Mrs. Voss's household for 2 of those 3 years, did not know in detail but suspected were not clean. The letters were private. They were young and unguarded, and they contained, as letters written in confidence often did, the kinds of things a person said when they were not performing. Fears, hopes, some sharp observations about specific London figures that would be deeply embarrassing if circulated. She was going to use them? Clara asked. She did use them, Mary said. That's why the Lawton girl left London last April. Mrs. Voss showed one of the letters to the right person, made clear there were more, and Miss Lawton went home before it became worse. And Blackthorne? Clara asked. He found out about it later, Mary said. After Miss Lawton was already gone, he was... She paused, chose her words. Angry, quietly, which is worse in a man like him. He confronted Mrs. Voss last spring, and she denied it, and he walked away and she thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't, Vivian said. It wasn't, Mary confirmed, because she has new letters now. She looked at Clara. About you, Miss Whitmore. The room went very still. How? Clara asked. Her voice was steady. She was making it steady. Letters you wrote, Mary said, from Dorset, before the season, to a friend. I don't know which friend. Mrs. Voss has connections in the postal system. There's a man who works at the sorting house who has done her this service before. Clara's hands, folded in her lap, pressed together hard. She thought about letters written to an old school friend, Anna Fletcher, now married in Wiltshire. Long letters, honest letters, the kind of letters she wrote when she needed to say things somewhere other than her own head. Letters that talked about the debt and the fear and her own resistance to the season's purpose. Letters that were probably sharp about London society. Letters that were probably, in places, about things a debutante in the middle of the marriage market could not afford to have circulated. She thought about Mary Sutton's phrase, the right person. What the right person, shown those letters, could do to what remained of the Whitmore name in this city. When? She asked. Soon, Mary said. She's waiting for the best moment, when the damage will be largest. She met Clara's eyes. After last night, after the Duke was seen leaving, she's deciding how to use the two things together. Your letters and his visit, woven into one story. His visit, Clara said. Do you know why he went there last night? Mary Sutton was quiet for a moment. He came to get the letters, she said. Miss Whitmore. That's why he went. He found out she had them, same way he found out about the Lawton letters too late, through someone in his household who'd heard something. He went last night to confront her and demand them back. The silence in the room lasted a long time. Vivian, who had been listening without speaking, said softly, "And she refused." "She refused, and she told him to be careful," Mary said. "Her exact words, which I heard through the door. The girl's letters are interesting reading, Your Grace. I'd think carefully before pushing me." Clara stood up. She didn't intend to. Her body simply made the decision before her mind confirmed it. She walked to the window and looked at the kitchen garden outside and the ordinary London afternoon beyond it, and she breathed. He had gone to Helena Voss to protect her. He had known about the letters. He had known what Voss was planning to do with them. And instead of warning Clara, instead of coming to her and explaining and asking what she wanted to do, he had gone himself, at midnight, after a ball where he had just told her he was less interested in the game than when it started. And he had walked into a woman's house to try to take back something that had been stolen from Clara's life before Clara even knew it was gone. And he had failed. And London had seen him leave. And now the story being told was the worst possible version, and Helena Voss was sitting somewhere in this city with Clara's letters in her possession and a timetable in her head, and the season had less than 3 weeks remaining. "Miss Sutton," Clara said, still looking at the garden. "Why are you telling me this? You've risked a great deal coming here." A long pause. "Because," Mary Sutton said, "before Mrs. Voss, I worked for another family. A family with a daughter who was in London for the season 7 years ago. Mrs. Voss did the same thing to her. Letters, timing, the right person at the right moment. That girl went home and she never came back and she never recovered what she lost." Her voice was flat with the flatness of old grief. "I should have done something then. I didn't. I was afraid." She paused. "I'm still afraid, Miss Whitmore, but I'm doing it anyway." Clara turned from the window. "Thank you," she said, and meant it entirely. Child, she needed to speak to Adrian. This was now not a matter of emotion or uncertainty or the complicated calculus of the plan. It was a matter of strategy. He had attempted something and failed and did not know that she knew. She needed to know what he knew, what he had been told, what leverage, if any, remained. She needed to understand the full shape of the problem before she could address it. This was what she told herself. It was mostly true. She sent a note through Vivian's household, not her own, and not to his house directly but to a club address that Vivian provided with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had navigated these channels before. The note said, "I know about Mrs. Voss. I know about the letters. I need to speak with you. C.W." She burned the draft. She sent the final version. She went home and sat with her mother over tea and talked about nothing in particular with the focused energy of someone keeping their surface calm because the alternative was not available. Her mother, pouring the second cup, said, "You're frightened." It was so simply and accurately said that Clara felt the ground shift slightly. "Yes," she said. "Tell me." "Not yet," Clara said. I need to understand it better first, before I explain it." Her mother looked at her for a long moment. Margaret Whitmore, who had spent 3 years quietly managing a crisis without burdening anyone, recognized that sentence from the inside. "All right," she said. "But not too long, Clara. I am more durable than you currently believe." Clara looked at her. "I know," she said. "I've always known that." Her mother set down the teapot, said nothing more, which was its own kind of strength. Adrian came to her at a public gathering because that was the only kind of meeting available to them, and he managed it with the precision of a man who had thought it through. It was a garden party at the home of a Lady Cresswell, an afternoon event, outdoor, comparatively relaxed in the season's social register, which meant that movement and conversation were less structured than in a ballroom, and small private exchanges less conspicuous. Clara arrived with Lady Hargrove, She found a position near the ornamental hedgerow at the garden's eastern edge, where the rose trellises provided some visual screening, and waited. He appeared within 10 minutes, which meant he had been watching for her arrival. He stopped beside her with the appearance of natural chance, both of them facing outward toward the garden, not directly at each other. "You got my note," she said. "I got your note." His voice was low. "I owe you an explanation." "You owe me several," she said. "But let's start with Mrs. Voss." He did not flinch from it. She had been watching for the flinch, the small defensive recalibration that people did when they were managing a lie. And it wasn't there. "I found out about your letters 4 days ago," he said. "A member of my household staff heard something through a connection of theirs in the postal service. I confirmed it through a second source." A pause. "I should have told you immediately. I didn't because I thought I could resolve it before it became necessary for you to know." "Why?" Clara said. The word was sharper than she intended. "Because I thought I could get them back," he said. "I thought if I went to Helena directly, applied sufficient—" He paused. "Applied sufficient pressure, she would give them up, and the matter would be closed, and you would never have to know how close it had come. And instead she refused you, and arranged for you to be seen leaving." "Yes," he said. "She knew you were coming." The pause this time was different. "Probably," he said. "My second source may not have been secure." "So she planned it," Clara said. "The visible exit, the timing, all of it. She knew you'd come because you'd gone before, when the Lawton letters surfaced, and she prepared for it." He was very still beside her. "Yes, that is likely the accurate reading." "And now she has my letters, and a story about you and a timetable," Clara said, "and less than 3 weeks remaining in the season." "Yes." "And your visit did not recover the letters, did not discourage her, and gave her an additional weapon to use." She paused. "I need you to understand that I am saying all of this not to attack you, but because I need to know what we are actually dealing with." "I understand," he said. His voice was steady, but something beneath the steadiness had cost him. She could hear it. "What does she want?" Clara asked. "Not what she says she wants. What does she actually want?" "She wants me to be afraid of her," he said. "She wants the particular satisfaction of having a blackthorn on her terms. She wanted it 3 years ago, and she didn't get it, and she's been waiting." "She wants power," Clara said. "Over you specifically." "Over me specifically." Clara looked at the garden. A group of young women were laughing at something near the fountain. The afternoon sun was good today, the kind of London afternoon that arrived rarely enough to feel like a gift. It seemed wrong that it was so beautiful. "I can get the letters back," Clara said. He turned to look at her, fully, no longer maintaining the pretense of facing outward. "What?" "Not through confrontation," she said. "She expects confrontation. She prepared for confrontation. She wants you to come to her again because every time you do, it confirms that she has something worth fighting over." Clara turned to meet his gaze. "I can get them back a different way." "Clara." He almost never used her name without the miss. The absence of it now registered. "You are not going anywhere near Helena Voss." "I'm not planning to go near Helena Voss," she said. "I'm planning to make the letters irrelevant." "That's not—" "Hear me out," she said. He closed his mouth. The muscle in his jaw was working, but he closed his mouth. "The letters contain things about London society," Clara said. "About the season, about the market, about what it feels like to be a woman being sold under the guise of courtship. If Helena Voss releases them expecting scandal, expecting shame, she's counting on the assumption that I will be destroyed by the exposure of my private thoughts." Clara paused. "But shame only has power if the person whose thoughts are exposed is ashamed of them." He stared at her. "I'm not ashamed of anything in those letters," Clara said. "I'm honest in them, the way I'm honest in everything. If she releases them expecting to find me cowering, and instead finds me—" She thought for a moment. "Standing in the open, having already acknowledged what I think and who I am, then the letters become not a weapon but a document that confirms what everyone who knows me already knows." "You're talking about removing the leverage," he said slowly. "I'm talking about removing the leverage. By preemptively—" He stopped. "You would have to speak publicly. about things that London does not consider appropriate topics for women to speak about publicly. Yes, Clara said. I know. It would not be without cost. Everything has been without cost, Clara said. I've been paying costs since I arrived. At least this cost would be mine to choose. He looked at her for a long moment. The garden moved around them. Laughter, a child running, the ordinary beautiful machinery of an afternoon in late spring. There's still the story she's building about me, he said, about last night. Even if your letters lose their power, she has the appearance of what I did, used against you. Then tell me what actually happened, Clara said. The whole thing, not the version you've been protecting me from. He did. It took a while. They remained at the edge of the garden, the rose trellises at their backs, and he told her about the Lawton girl. All of it, not the edited version, not the version that made him look better than the events warranted. He told her that he had been careless with Eliza Lawton, in the sense that he had paid her attention without examining what he was doing or what she might reasonably hope from it, and that when he had understood the situation clearly, he had ended it abruptly rather than carefully, and that the abruptness had been its own unkindness. He told her that he had found out about Helena's letters too late to prevent the damage, and that the confrontation last spring had been angry and poorly managed and had accomplished nothing except alerting Helena to the fact that he would come to her aid for someone he cared about. Which she filed away, Clara said. Which she filed away, he confirmed. For use against the next person I cared about. His voice was even. She's been waiting for this for a year. The next person I cared about. It landed quietly, without performance, as though it were just the factual descriptor of the situation, as though he had stopped managing what he let her hear. You should have told me, Clara said, 2 weeks ago, when you found out about my letters. Yes, he said. I should have. Why didn't you trust me with it? He was quiet for a moment. Because, he said, I have spent a considerable portion of my adult life managing problems alone. It is a habit I appear to maintain even when it is clearly the wrong approach. He paused. I was wrong. I am telling you that directly and without qualification. She absorbed this. Blackthorn, she said. Yes. I need you to trust me with this now, she said. I need you to tell me everything you know about Helena Voss's household, her schedule, her contacts. I need to know who she's already spoken to about the letters and who she's planning to speak to. What are you going to do? Something inadvisable, Clara said. Probably. For the first time in the conversation, something in his face loosened. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one, the way a door is adjacent to the room it opens into. I'll tell you everything I know, he said, on one condition. Which is? You tell me what you're planning before you do it, he said. Not after, not instead of, before. So you can stop me? So I can help you, he said. There's a difference. She looked at him. He looked back. The afternoon light fell between them, and somewhere in the garden a child laughed, and the roses behind her gave off that specific June scent that she would remember precisely for the rest of her life. All right, she said. What she was planning required Mary Sutton's continued cooperation, which she obtained through a second meeting at Vivian's house the following afternoon. Mary was frightened still. The fear had not diminished, but she had come back, which meant the fear was not in charge. She was also, as it turned out, in possession of considerably more information than she had shared at the first meeting, because she had spent the intervening day listening more carefully than usual in Helena Voss's household, and what she heard had alarmed her enough to accelerate her timeline. She's moving faster, Mary said. I don't know what changed, but she's meeting with Lady Price tonight and she's taking the letters. Tonight, Vivian said. We have until tonight, Clara said. The plan, the actual plan, the one she had described in outline to Adrian and then worked through in full with Vivian and Mary over 2 careful hours, depended on timing. It depended on doing 3 things in the right order before Helena Voss put the letters in Lady Price's hands, at which point they would spread through the social network of the season with the speed and comprehensive coverage of a fire in a paper mill. The first thing? Adrian's contacts in the postal service, and he had them, it turned out, through the same channels Helena had been exploiting, because a man of his resources and his awareness of his own vulnerabilities had made it his business to understand how information moved in this city, needed to determine whether the letters could be retrieved before reaching Voss's hands. They could not. This was confirmed by early afternoon. The letters were already in her possession. The second thing, Clara needed to speak to 3 specific women before the evening. Not Vivian, not Lady Hargrove. 3 women she had identified in 6 weeks of careful observation as the season's actual information infrastructure. Not the loudest voices, not the highest ranked, but the women whose opinions moved through the drawing rooms and morning calls and correspondence chains and shaped what London thought before London knew it was thinking anything. Mrs. Alderton, Lady Cavendish Parks, a sharp, quiet widow named Mrs. Fenn, who had seemed a background figure at every gathering but whom Clara had watched and concluded was in fact a fulcrum. She visited all 3 between 2 and 5 o'clock. Lady Hargrove's carriage, Lady Hargrove's footman, Lady Hargrove conspicuously uninformed about the content of the calls. At each visit, she was direct. She said that she understood certain private letters of hers were about to be circulated. She said that she would prefer the opportunity to speak for herself, rather than have her words interpreted for her by someone with a specific agenda. She told them, with the measured honesty that Vivian had once identified as her genuine gift, what the letters contained in general, her private thoughts about the marriage market, her feelings about the season's purpose, her fears for her family. Nothing shameful, she said. Nothing she was not willing to own in the daylight. What she was not, she said, quietly, to each of them, watching their faces, was a fool who had been ambushed by a man's charming game and left humiliated. That was the story being prepared for them. She wanted them to have heard her before they received it. Mrs. Alderton, who had hosted Clara's very first London event, and who had been watching the price situation with what Clara now read as genuine discomfort, said, "You're very brave, Miss Whitmore." "I'm very practical," Clara said. Bravery and practicality look the same from the outside sometimes. Mrs. Fenn, the last of the 3, said nothing for a long moment after Clara finished. Then she said, "Lady Price has overextended herself this season. This is not the first time she has done this with someone. It is the first time someone has done this in response." "I prefer the direct approach," Clara said. "Yes," Mrs. Fenn said. "I had noticed." The third thing was the hardest, and she had been putting it off until last for that reason. She went home and she told her mother. All of it. From the letters to Helena Voss to Adrian to the plan. She sat in the small parlor and she said it clearly and without editorializing, the way you presented a set of facts when the person across from you was capable of handling facts and deserved not to be protected from them. Her mother listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. "The letters," her mother said finally. "In them, what exactly did you say?" "The truth," Clara said. "About what I was afraid of. About not wanting to be sold. About thinking the season was—" She paused. "About thinking the whole apparatus was built for everyone's benefit except the woman at the center of it." Her mother was quiet. "You can tell me if you're angry," Clara said. "I'm not angry," Margaret Whitmore said. She looked at her hands, the roughened hands, the scar on the left index finger. "I know the letters were not about me. They were about being 22 and frightened and trying to find the shape of a life that doesn't feel like defeat." She paused. "I wrote similar letters once. To your grandmother." Clara stared at her. "Did you think," her mother said, looking up, "that I came to this willingly? That I chose your father for love at the first attempt?" She shook her head, not bitterly, just clearly. "My father had debts too, Clara. Most families do in the end. The question is not whether you are sold. The question is whether you negotiate the terms well enough to make the life worth having afterward." "And did you?" Clara asked. "With father?" Her mother's expression did something complicated and quiet. "Eventually," she said. "It took time. It took choosing to see who he actually was rather than who I was afraid he might be." A pause. "Your father was extraordinary. It took me 3 years to let myself believe that." Clara sat with this. "The Duke," her mother said. "I haven't made any decisions," Clara said. "No," her mother agreed. "But you're defending him with your whole body while claiming not to have made any decisions. which I find quite clarifying." Clara opened her mouth, closed it. Her mother almost smiled. By the time evening came, the plan was as complete as it was going to be. What happened next was not what Clara expected, because the thing about plans was that they accounted for the variables you could see and not for the ones you hadn't imagined yet. She was at home, changed, rested, in the interval between their own evening engagement beginning and the current hour. Vivian's message would come when something moved, and she was waiting for it. The message that arrived was not from Vivian. It was delivered by hand to the Hargrove townhouse at 6:30 on plain paper in a handwriting she recognized immediately. "Miss Whitmore, do not proceed with whatever you are planning tonight. Helena Voss no longer has the letters. Come to Cavendish Street if you wish to understand. Bring Mrs. Ashworth. Come now. Blackthorn." She read it 3 times. Then she called for the carriage. The house on Cavendish Street was Adrian's London residence, and it was the first time she had seen it, a broad, serious Georgian house, well maintained, the kind of house that did not need to announce its quality, because the quality was structural rather than decorative. Vivian, beside her in the carriage, had read the note and said nothing except, "I know this house. He doesn't invite people here." A butler she did not know received them with the practiced calm of household staff trained to manage the unexpected, and led them to a study that was, she noticed it immediately, a room that told the truth about the person who worked in it. Books, real ones, annotated in the margins. Maps on one wall. Papers on the desk that were clearly actual work rather than performance. A single painting above the fireplace that she recognized, with a small start, as a landscape of the Dorset coastline. Adrian was standing when they came in. He was not alone. Mary Sutton was there, seated near the fire with a cup of tea and the expression of someone who has recently survived something significant. And beside Mary, seated carefully, was a woman Clara had never seen. 40, perhaps. Dark eyes. Beautiful in the way that showed wear, the beauty of a face that had carried a great deal, and not all of it willingly. She was dressed well. She was pale. "Miss Whitmore," Adrian said. "Thank you for coming quickly." His eyes held something she could not immediately read. "I believe you and Mrs. Sutton know each other. I'd like to introduce—" He paused, just briefly. "Mrs. Eliza Marsden, formerly Miss Eliza Lawton." Clara went very still. "Miss Lawton," Vivian said softly from beside her. The woman looked up. Her eyes went to Adrian and then, carefully, to Clara. "Miss Whitmore," she said. Her voice was steady with the steadiness of someone who has made a decision they are still in the process of carrying through. "I came to London 3 days ago. I haven't told anyone I'm here except—" a gesture toward Adrian. "And now you." She reached into the small bag on her lap and placed a packet of papers on the table beside her chair. "Mrs. Voss still has your letters, but these are the originals of mine. I kept copies, as it turns out, and I am prepared to use them." "Use them how?" Clara asked. "To end this," Eliza Marsden said. "The letters she took from me contain her words, not just mine. Things she wrote to me during the period she was cultivating my acquaintance. Things that make very clear what her actual intentions were." Her jaw was set. There was something magnificent in her composure. The composure of a woman who had been injured by something and had spent a year deciding what to do about it and was now doing it. "If my letters are made public, so are hers. If yours are released, I release mine, and hers." She paused. "I sent her that message this afternoon, along with an itemized list of what I have." "She hasn't responded yet," Adrian said, "but she will, and the response will not be distribution." The room was very quiet. Clara looked at Eliza Marsden, a woman who had been ruined by this city's version of a game and had come back from the country she'd been sent to and walked back into it with the evidence she'd spent a year assembling for a woman she had never met. "Why?" Clara asked. "Not the strategy of it, the why of it." Eliza Marsden looked at her steadily. "Because someone should have done it for me," she said, "and no one did." The silence held. Then Clara sat down because her legs had decided they were done. Adrian crouched in front of her, which was not at all a position she had ever imagined him in. Level with her, at eye height, present in the way that didn't maintain careful aristocratic distance. "Are you all right?" he said. She looked at him, very close at this proximity, the intelligent eyes, the face that had been all sharp angles when she first saw it across a room, and now, close up, showed the lines of something more than the reputation that had preceded it. "You knew she was coming," Clara said. "That's why you sent the note." "She wrote to me 2 days ago," he said. "I wasn't certain she'd follow through. She's braver than I gave her credit for." "You should have told me." "Yes," he said. Again, yes. He held her gaze. "I'm still learning what it means to let someone else into the problem." "You are extraordinarily bad at it," Clara said. "I know." A pause. "I'm told the condition is not incurable." Something in her chest did the thing it had been doing for weeks. The thing she had been naming as complication, as risk, as a variable outside the plan. Naming it that because the alternative name was one she had not been ready to say out loud. She was closer to ready now. She could feel it, the way you could feel a door that was about to open, the particular quality of air around a threshold. But the threshold had not yet been crossed, because from the hallway came the sound of the butler, and a new voice, and Vivian, from her chair beside the fire, sat forward with an expression of sharp attention, and Adrian straightened and turned, and the door opened, and the butler said, "I apologize, Your Grace. She would not wait." Helena Voss stood in the doorway. She was everything the whispers had said, striking, composed, the particular confidence of a woman who had always made the room come to her rather than going to it. Her eyes moved across the room with rapid professional speed, registering Vivian, registering Mary Sutton, stopping on Eliza Marsden with something that was not quite surprise because she had clearly suspected, and then settling, finally, on Clara. She looked at Clara for a long moment. "Miss Whitmore," she said. Her voice was a weapon, and she was pointing it. "I came to deliver something to the Duke, but I find the full audience is already assembled." She opened the small case in her hands. "I believe these are yours." She held out a packet of letters. Clara's letters. She could see her own handwriting on the topmost page from across the room. "I've decided," Helena Voss said, with the smoothness of a woman recalculating in real time and presenting the recalculation as a choice she had always intended, "that I have no further use for them." No one in the room spoke. "Consider it a gesture of goodwill," she said. She set the packet on the table near the door. She looked at Adrian with an expression that was, beneath the polish, beneath the performance, something old and unresolved and tired. Then she left. The room held its silence for a moment after the door closed. Then Vivian exhaled. Mary Sutton put her face in her hands, not in distress but in the posture of someone letting go of something they had been holding very tightly. Eliza Marsden looked at the packet of letters on the table and then at her own hands, and something in her face did something private and final, like a settlement made. Adrian picked up the letters. He crossed the room. He handed them to Clara. She looked at them. Her handwriting. Her fears. The inside of herself exfiltrated and returned. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that quality she had been observing for weeks. The careful openness, the deliberate visibility of a man deciding, repeatedly, to be seen. "It's over?" she said. "It's over," he said. She should have felt relief. She did feel relief. It was there, large and real and unambiguous. But underneath it was something else, something that had been waiting for the immediate crisis to pass to announce itself, something that was moving now with the quiet, unstoppable force of a tide that had made up its mind. She stood up. "I need," she said carefully, "to speak to you alone." Vivian stood from her chair with the efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for this sentence. "Eliza," she said, "let me get you a proper dinner and a room for the night. You look like you haven't slept properly in 3 days." She guided Mrs. Marsden from the room with the practiced ease of someone managing the transition between scenes. Mary Sutton followed, pausing at the door to exchange a look with Clara that was brief and complete. And then it was just them. The study, the books, the Dorset coastline above the fireplace. Clara held the letters in both hands and looked at him. "I need you to understand something," she said. All right, he said. I came to London with a plan, she said. A sensible, practical plan that was designed to protect my family and secure the Grange and ensure that the people who depend on the Whitmore land would continue to have what they need. She paused. That plan was not wrong. It was the right plan for the situation. I know, he said. And I need you to know, she said, that what I'm about to say has nothing to do with Helena Voss or the letters or the events of this evening. Those things clarified something, but they did not create it. He was very still. I have been afraid, Clara said, of wanting something I wasn't sure I could trust. I have been very careful about the difference between what I need and what I want, because in my experience those two things are not the same, and confusing them leads to a very particular kind of ruin. Yes, he said softly. I'm not confused about them anymore, she said. I know what I need, and I know what I want. And I know that you are... She stopped, looked at him fully. I know that you are not what you appeared to be when I walked into a ballroom and saw you for the first time. And I know that I am not what I appeared to be either. And I know that is the truth. That we have managed somehow in the middle of this extraordinary circus to show each other something real. He crossed the room. Not quickly. Nothing with him was quick. Nothing with him was imprecise. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes, the specific quality of attention that he had always given her, full and undivided. Clara, he said. And the way he said it, just her name, just that, without title or distance, was the most undisguised thing she had ever heard from a human being. She opened her mouth to say something, the right next thing, whatever it was. And then the door opened. Not Vivian, not Mary. The butler, his face a careful mask over evident discomfort. I apologize, Your Grace. There is a gentleman. He insists it is urgent. He has shown me a document. Behind him, a man appeared. Clara did not know him. He was perhaps 60, in traveling clothes that showed hours of hard road, his face white with the specific whiteness of someone who has been running from something. He looked at Adrian. Your Grace, he said, and his voice shook. There has been an incident at Ravenmoor, the North Estate. A pause. A fire, the tenants, the village. Your steward sent me with the account. 3 families have lost their homes. 2 men were injured pulling the children out. The cause is, he faltered, pulled a sealed document from his coat. It was not an accident. The room went very cold. Adrian took the document. He read it. Clara watched his face, which had gone very still in the way she now recognized. Not absence, but the absolute economy of a man taking a crisis into himself and beginning, immediately, to address it. He looked up. He looked at Clara. And in his eyes was the war between 2 things she understood precisely. The man who had spent his life solving problems alone, and the man who had, over the course of one London season, begun to learn what it meant not to. She held his gaze. Tell me, she said. He told her, not the abbreviated version, not the managed version that preserved his composure at the cost of the actual information. He told her the full accounting, standing in his study with the steward's letter in his hand, and Clara 3 feet away with her own letters still pressed between her palms, and neither of them pretending that the world outside the door was not demanding an immediate response. The fire had started in the grain storage on the north edge of the Ravenmoor estate village, a building he had been planning to replace for 2 years, a project delayed by a legal dispute with a neighboring landowner over the boundary line the building sat on. The dispute was with a man named Aldous Crane, who had been contesting the boundary for 4 years through solicitors and county magistrates and every available instrument of slow legal attrition. Adrian had been winning, slowly, expensively, but winning. The most recent ruling had gone in his favor and had, his solicitor believed, effectively closed the matter. The fire, the steward's letter indicated, had started at 3 in the morning. A lantern left carelessly, officially. Except that the building had not been in use at that hour, the lantern would have had no reason to be lit, and 2 of Crane's men had been seen in the village that afternoon by 3 separate witnesses who had not yet been formally interviewed because the local magistrate, a man with whom, the steward wrote with careful, alarmed understatement, Crane had a long friendship, had so far declined to open an inquiry. 3 families had lost everything stored in that building. 2 men were burned, not severely, the letter said, but painfully, because they had gone into the adjacent cottages to pull children out when the sparks jumped. One of those men was a tenant farmer who had been on Ravenmoor land for 23 years. "He has a name," Clara said when Adrian reached that part. "Thomas Briggs," Adrian said. He has 4 children. "And the magistrate won't open an inquiry. Not without considerable pressure." "Which you'll apply," Clara said. "I'm leaving for Ravenmoor in the morning," he said. "Tonight if the horses can be ready." "They can," Clara said. And then, before she had fully decided to say it, "I'm coming with you." He looked at her. "Not because of—" She stopped, reorganized. The families who lost their storage, the burned man and his 4 children, the boundary dispute, and the building you delayed replacing. These are all things that a properly managed estate should have addressed before they became a crisis, and I say that not to accuse you, but because I know what it looks like when land and people get caught between a landlord's legal battles and the actual requirements of daily survival. She held his gaze. "I grew up in a house with all of those problems, and I have spent more time than I can account for trying to solve them with insufficient resources. I am useful in this situation, more useful than staying in London watching the season conclude." "Your mother," he said, "Lady Hargrove, the season isn't—" "The season," Clara said, "has largely accomplished what it was going to accomplish. The outstanding question does not require me to be in London to be resolved." She paused. "Does it?" It was not quite a question. He looked at her for a long moment with that full, undivided attention that she had stopped trying to be unaffected by. "No," he said. "It doesn't." "Then I'm coming," she said. "With your mother's lady's maid, because Vivian will insist, and with my own maid, because my mother will insist, and with a letter to my mother explaining the situation in the terms most likely to produce her consent, which I will write in the next 20 minutes. She looked at him steadily. "I am not asking for permission. I am informing you of the plan." Adrian Blackthorne, Duke of Ravenmoor, looked at the woman standing in his study holding her own recovered letters and mapping his crisis with the precision of a general identifying terrain and said, "I know." "Good," Clara said. She went to find Vivian. The letter to her mother was harder to write than she expected, because the honest version of it required saying things she had not yet said aloud in quite this configuration. She wrote 3 drafts at the small desk in Vivian's borrowed parlor, discarding 2, and sent the 3rd by hand with the footman at 11 o'clock at night, which meant her mother would read it before morning. The 3rd draft said, among other things, "I believe this is the right thing to do, and not only for the practical reasons I have listed above. I believe Adrian Blackthorne is a man of genuine character who has been managing significant responsibilities alone for too long, and that what is happening at his estate is a situation I have the knowledge and the capability to help address. I also believe, and I want to be honest with you because you asked me to be, and because you deserve it, that the plan has not failed. The plan has simply evolved. I think you will understand this when you meet him." She sealed it and handed it over and did not allow herself to second-guess it. Vivian, reading over her shoulder in the way she had apparently decided was permissible at this stage of their friendship, said, "The plan has evolved. That is a very elegant way to describe falling in love with the most complicated man in London." "I haven't said anything about falling in love," Clara said. "No," Vivian agreed. "You've merely decided to travel to his northern estate in the middle of the night to help him manage an arson investigation and a corrupt magistrate." She paused. "Purely practical." "Entirely practical," Clara said. Vivian looked at her with the expression of someone who is choosing, generously, not to press the point. They left London at midnight in 2 carriages, Adrian's traveling coach with the steward's messenger riding alongside, and a second carriage that Clara, her maid Nell, and Vivian occupied, with a supply chest that Vivian had assembled with startling efficiency from her own household in the space of 40 minutes, containing provisions, correspondence materials, and what she described as the necessities for a woman who may be required to manage difficult people under cold northern conditions. The road north from London was hard and dark and smelled of wet earth and early summer, and the miles rolled under them with the rhythm of urgency. Clara did not sleep. She sat by the window and watched the dark countryside pass and thought about what she knew about estate disputes and tenant management and the particular problem of a magistrate who was a friend of the opposing party. She had grown up watching her father navigate exactly these channels, the careful dance of county politics, where direct confrontation usually lost in patient, strategic accumulation of the right pressure applied to the right person was the difference between resolution and ruin. She thought about Thomas Briggs with his 4 children and his 23 years on Ravenmoor land and his burned hands. She thought about what it meant to be the person above someone in the chain and whether you were paying attention. She thought about her father, who had not paid sufficient attention to the financial chain until it was too late, and who had nonetheless always paid attention to the people, Mrs. Bates and the Harlows and every other family whose lives ran through the Whitmore land like roots through soil. She thought about a duke who built schools in Southwark and didn't tell anyone, who settled lending library accounts for families he'd never met, who had walked into a dangerous woman's house at midnight to protect a set of letters belonging to a woman he had known for 6 weeks. She thought, this is who he is, not the reputation. This. She thought, I know the difference now. Around 3 in the morning, the carriages stopped at a coaching inn to change horses, and she climbed out to stretch her legs and found Adrian standing in the inn yard, and they stood in the cold summer dark together without speaking for a moment, the horses blowing steam in the lamplight. You should sleep, he said. It's another 4 hours. So should you, she said. I can't, he said. Not until I see it. She understood that. She understood that the distance between knowing something had happened and being present in the place where it happened was, for certain kinds of people, an unbearable gap. She had felt it when the letter came from Mrs. Bates about the Harlow family's son. The need to be there, to see the actual situation, to understand it in its real dimensions rather than through the compression of words on paper. Tell me about the village, she said. He looked at her. Why? Because you know it and I don't, she said. And because talking about it is better than standing here in the dark worrying about it. He told her about the village. Its name was Ravensford, 140 people, 3 generations of some families on the land. He told her about the mill at the north end that had been repaired twice in 5 years. He told her about the school the village children attended, not his Southwark school, but a dame school run by a widow named Mrs. Halloway, who was, he said, one of the most capable people he had encountered in any setting. He told her about the disputed boundary and the history of it, and he told her about Aldous Crane with the flat economy of a man describing a problem he had been managing for a long time and was extremely tired of. Crane isn't the problem, Clara said when he finished. He looked at her. He ordered the fire. Probably, she said, but you can't prove that yet. The problem is the magistrate, because without an inquiry, you have 3 witness accounts that go nowhere, and Crane knows that. She thought for a moment. Who are the county magistrates above the local one? What's the circuit? He told her. And who among them would act on a formal complaint from a peer, presented with 3 witness accounts and a statement from your steward? Sir William Pembridge, he said without hesitation. He's a fair man, old-fashioned but fair. If the documentation were thorough, then the documentation will be thorough, Clara said. When we arrive, you speak to Thomas Briggs and the other witnesses. I'll write the statements. I've been writing accounts and formal correspondence since I was 16, and my father's hand became unreliable. She met his eyes in the lamplight. I know how to present evidence in a way that moves people. He was quiet for a long moment. You're already managing this, he said. I'm already helping manage this, she said. It's a distinction I'll be enforcing consistently, so you should note it early. He did the thing that was almost a smile. In the lamplight, it reached further than usual. Noted, he said, consistently. The horses were ready. They climbed back into their respective carriages. 4 more hours of dark road, and at the end of it, the thing that needed to be addressed. Clara finally slept briefly in the last hour before dawn, and dreamed about nothing she could remember when the carriage wheels changed their sound, and she woke to gray morning light and the sight of stone walls and a village and smoke still faintly visible against the low sky to the north. Ravenmoor, real and damaged and waiting. She was ready. The grain storage was a ruin. 4 walls still standing, the interior gutted, the smell of old fire and wet ash hanging over the north end of the village with the particular persistence of damage that had been wet down but not healed. The 2 adjacent cottages had scorch marks on their eastern walls, but had been saved. The village men had formed a bucket line fast enough, which was itself a testament to how quickly and well a community could move when it had been managing its own survival for generations. Thomas Briggs received them in his cottage, a small, clean space, his wife managing the space around him with the efficiency of someone keeping difficult circumstances from becoming catastrophic. His hands were bandaged. He stood when Adrian entered, which Clara watched Adrian acknowledge with a handshake rather than a gesture to sit, the handshake of 2 men with a long mutual account. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," Adrian said, simply, directly. Thomas Briggs, 50 years old and burned and steady as old stone, said, "You're here now, Your Grace." Clara sat with the family for an hour. Not as an observer, she helped the wife, Martha, with the morning's work, the way she had learned that you establish trust with practical people not through speaking but through being useful. And while she worked, she asked questions and listened to the answers and built the full picture of what had happened, who had seen what, at what time, from what position. The 3 witnesses were clear in what they had seen. Crane's men, 2 of them, late afternoon, seen by Briggs's eldest son coming out of Crane's hired field adjacent to the storage building. Seen again 2 hours later near the north wall by old Mrs. Farrow, who was 80 and whose eyesight was apparently still considerable. Seen leaving on the road toward Crane's property by a young man named Jack Corey, who had been coming home from a neighbor's house and whose account was the most specific. He had recognized one of the men by name. "He knows one of them," Clara said to Adrian in the yard outside Briggs's cottage, while Vivian was inside helping Martha with what had turned into an impromptu breakfast for 6 people. "By name. That's significant. Jack Corey is 19 years old and dependent on the goodwill of everyone in this county for his livelihood," Adrian said. "Standing up and naming Crane's man in front of a hostile magistrate is asking him to take a risk he shouldn't have to take alone." "Then he won't take it alone," Clara said. "He'll take it in a formal statement to Sir William Pembridge, presented alongside 2 other witness accounts and your steward's documented evidence, as part of a package that makes it impossible for a fair magistrate to decline inquiry." She looked at him. "How quickly can you get a meeting with Pembridge?" "He's in York," Adrian said. 3 hours' ride." "Then write to him today and ride there tomorrow," Clara said. "I'll have the statements ready by this evening." Adrian looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the expression of a man whose solitary habits were encountering something that made them feel, for the first time, genuinely unnecessary. "You've done this before," he said. "I've done the Dorset version of this," she said. "Smaller stakes, smaller county, same machinery." She paused. "My father always said that the law, properly applied with sufficient documentation and the right person reading it, was the most powerful tool a person of limited resources had available. The trick was learning to use it before it was used against you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have dealt with the building dispute a year ago." "Probably," she said. "But you didn't, and the reason you didn't was because the legal battle was taking your attention, and that's what Crane was counting on, that the attrition would distract you from the physical reality of the situation until it became an emergency." She met his eyes. "That's what people like Crane always count on, the slow grind. You stop it by refusing to be ground." He held her gaze for a long, steady moment. "Where did you come from?" he said. It was said with something quiet and wondering in it, nothing of the calculated charm she had first encountered across a London ballroom. "Dorset," she said, "as previously established." He laughed, really laughed, the way she had only heard once before. And it was better in open air under a gray northern sky with the smell of old fire still in the air. More real, less careful. She stored it somewhere specific. "The statements," she said. "I'll start with Thomas Briggs." Hashem. She worked through the afternoon. Vivian, who had apparently decided that the organizational management of a crisis was the natural extension of her London social competence, moved through the village with a quiet authority that astonished Clara and seemed, after an initial assessment period, to be fully accepted by the village women. By midday, she had established a clear accounting of what each affected family needed, had identified which needs were immediate versus which could wait a week, and had begun drafting a letter to Adrian's London solicitor outlining the required disbursements. "You've done this before," Clara told her, echoing Adrian's words without intending to. "My husband's estate in Lincolnshire," Vivian said, without looking up from her writing. "Flood, 8 years ago. 6 families displaced. The thing about a crisis on land is that it requires exactly the same skills as running a season: information management, resource allocation, and the ability to remain calm while everyone around you is deciding whether to panic." "And does your husband know you do this?" "My husband," Vivian said, "is a man of excellent character who understands that his household functions because I run it and has the wisdom to be grateful rather than threatened." She looked up. "They exist, Clara. Men who are grateful rather than threatened. They're simply not the majority." Clara thought about a man in a coaching inn yard at 3 in the morning, telling her about his village because she asked and he answered, because she said it was better than standing in the dark worrying, because he had, without announcement or ceremony, begun to treat her as someone worth telling things to. "No," she said, "they're not the majority." She went back to the statements. By evening, she had 5 formal witness accounts: Briggs's eldest son, old Mrs. Farrow, Jack Corey, a 4th witness she had found through conversation with the village's blacksmith, and the steward's own documented account with times and observations appended. Each statement was written in the clean, direct style her father had taught her. No embellishment, no emotional appeal, only specific observable facts presented in chronological order with supporting details that would be difficult to dismiss and harder to contradict. She read them back with the critical eye of someone looking for weakness, tightened 2 passages, and brought the finished package to Adrian at 9 o'clock in the evening. He read every page. He read them the way he read everything, with full attention, the way she had noticed he gave full attention to whatever he was actually doing, rather than distributing it thinly across several things at once. When he finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Pembridge will act on this," he said. "He should," Clara said. "If he's the man you say he is." "He is." Adrian set the papers down on the estate table. "Clara, this is... The Corey statement alone is significant. The way you've structured it, the specific details, the timing corroboration, it makes it very difficult for a magistrate to look at the local situation and argue it's insufficient for inquiry. That was the intention," she said. "I know. I'm saying..." He stopped, began again. "I'm saying that you have just done in one afternoon something my steward and my solicitor have been trying to do for 3 days and failing because they were thinking about it as a legal problem rather than as a documentation problem." "Most legal problems," Clara said, "are documentation problems at their core." He looked at her across the estate table with its spread of papers and maps and the evidence she had assembled, and what was in his expression was not the careful openness she had been observing for weeks. It was something past that. Something more settled. Recognition, she thought. The specific look of a person recognizing something they had been looking for without a clear name for it. "I'm going to ride to York tomorrow," he said. "I'd like you to come." She looked at him. "To meet Pembridge. To present this," he said. "You built it. You know it better than anyone. And Pembridge is a man who respects precision. Watching the person who assembled this material present it in person will be more effective than me presenting it secondhand." He paused. "Also, I want you there. I want you there, specifically. I should say that clearly instead of only giving you the practical argument." She felt the territory shift again, the slow tectonic thing. "I want to be there," she said, "specifically," and left the echo of his phrasing deliberate. Walk. The meeting with Sir William Pembridge was not what Clara expected, because she had constructed in her mind a figure from the description, old-fashioned, fair, formal, and the actual man was all of those things, and also, unexpectedly, funny. He was 65, broad, with a face that showed a long lifetime of taking things seriously without losing the ability to laugh at them, and he received them in his study with the attention of a man who had been doing this long enough to know immediately when something was worth his full focus. Adrian made the introduction. Clara placed the documentation on the desk. Pembridge read it. He read it the way people who were genuinely careful read things, slowly returning to passages, making small sounds that were not responses so much as acknowledgments of ongoing processing. He had questions, which Clara answered. He had a specific question about the timing corroboration in the Corey statement, which she had anticipated and had a supporting annotation prepared for. At one point, he looked up at her over the papers and said, "You wrote this." "I did. In one afternoon." "It was a long afternoon," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the assessing clarity of someone who had spent 40 years measuring the quality of the people in front of him. Then he looked at Adrian. "Your Grace," he said, "where has this woman been for the last 3 years of your dispute with Crane?" "Dorset," Adrian said. "Pity," Pembridge said. He looked back at the papers. "I'm opening an inquiry. Formally, today, over the jurisdiction of your local magistrate. The 3 witness accounts are sufficient, and the corroborating detail in the steward's documentation makes the case for conflict of interest with respect to local oversight." He set the papers down. "Crane will hear about this before week's end. He'll attempt to manage it." "He'll fail," Clara said. Pembridge looked at her again. "The documentation is already lodged with you," she said. "If he attempts to manage the witnesses, that becomes obstruction, which compounds the case against him. If he attempts to manage the inquiry, he does it in front of you, not in front of his friend." She paused. "The only thing he can do now is attempt to discredit the witnesses, and the witnesses, sir, particularly Corey and Mrs. Farrow, are not discreditable. Corey is young and known in the community and has nothing to gain from the account. Mrs. Farrow is 80 and has been in that village since before Crane's grandfather was born. They'll be tried and found clean." Pembridge set his pen down and looked at her with an expression that had moved past assessment into something that resembled respect. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "have you considered the law as a profession?" "Women can't practice law," Clara said. "No," Pembridge agreed. "A significant oversight." He stood. "I'll have the formal inquiry notice prepared by this afternoon. You'll have a copy before you leave York." They left his office an hour later with the inquiry notice folded in Clara's document case, and the afternoon light falling clean and real across the York cobblestones, and Adrian beside her on the steps of the building saying nothing for a moment, just looking at the street. "Well," he said. "Yes," she said. "Pembridge asked me, while you were reviewing the notice," he said, "whether you were my solicitor." Clara looked at him. "I told him no," he said. He said that was also a pity. She felt something in her chest do the thing it had been doing, the persistent, warm, complicated thing she had been calling by careful neutral names for weeks. Looking at him in the York afternoon light, she decided, very quietly, to stop calling it neutral names. She was in love with him. She had been falling toward it since a lending library on a Tuesday, and a waltz where he had said, "Some things are worth being precise about," and she had understood even then, even through all the careful management, that he was talking about her. She was in love with him, and she was not afraid of it anymore. The crisis and the dark road and the burned hands and the documentation in Pembridge's study had cleared something that the London season's careful social fog had been obscuring. The plain, undramatic fact of a man who was exactly who he appeared to be when you looked without the performance layer, and who she had apparently been looking at exactly that way from very nearly the beginning. "Adrian," she said. He looked at her. She was going to say, "I need to tell you something I've been avoiding saying." She was going to say, "I am not afraid of you or this or what it costs." She was going to say, "I have stopped planning around you and started planning with you, and I think you should know that." What she actually said was, "We should get back. The inquiry notice needs to be delivered to your steward before evening." He held her gaze for one beat, two, the way he always did when he was taking in what she had actually said alongside what she hadn't said. "Yes," he said, "we should get back." They walked toward the waiting carriage through the York afternoon, and she thought, later. I will say it later, when there isn't an inquiry notice in my document case and 3 families waiting in a village and a corrupt landowner about to be interrupted in his comfortable sense of immunity. Later. But later, as it turned out, was closer than she thought. The news reached Ravensford before they did. Not the inquiry notice, the news of it. In the efficient way of rural communities where information traveled faster than carriages, Pembridge's formal opening of the inquiry had already been communicated through the county circuit's channels before Adrian and Clara were back on the road, and by the time their carriage turned into the Ravenmoor estate, the steward was waiting with the particular expression of a man who has received news that is both excellent and alarming. Crane's solicitor has been at the magistrate's office in town, the steward said, trying to get ahead of it. The magistrate told him there was nothing he could do. Pembridge's notice supersedes local authority. Good, Adrian said. There's also... The steward hesitated. The village, sir. They know. I don't know how it moved that fast, but they know the inquiry is open. Thomas Briggs is outside. He was, standing in the yard with his bandaged hands at his sides, and his eldest son beside him, and 3 other men she recognized from the village behind him. And when Adrian climbed down from the carriage, Thomas Briggs said, "Is it true, Your Grace? Pembridge himself?" "Himself," Adrian said. "Formally lodged this afternoon." Something moved through Thomas Briggs's face. Not theatrical relief, not performance. The real thing, the quiet, enormous real thing, the face of a man who has been holding the weight of a wrong that has been done to him and has been told that the weight is being lifted. "Miss Whitmore," he said, turning to Clara as she came down from the carriage. "We heard it was the documentation, that she built the case." "She did," Adrian said. Thomas Briggs looked at Clara with the direct, clear gaze of a working man who had no time for social conventions that didn't serve truth. "Then I owe you a debt, Miss Whitmore." "You owe me nothing," Clara said. "You saw what happened and told it honestly. That's what made the case. I just wrote down what you knew." He shook his head slightly. Not disagreement, but the gesture of a man who knew the difference between what she was saying and what was actually true, and who chose not to argue it for now. The men behind him shifted. One of them, the blacksmith, she recognized him, said very simply, "Thank you." It was said to both of them. She understood it was said to both of them. She stood in the Ravenmoor yard in the early evening with the smell of old fire still faint in the distance, and the inquiry notice in her document case, and the village men looking at her with the plain, direct gratitude of people who had not expected someone to show up and do the thing that needed doing. And she felt something she had not felt since Dorset, the specific, uncomplicated solidity of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was built to do. She thought about her father, about his library and his debts, and his belief that arguing clearly was the most important skill a person could have. About how he had made her argue her way through every problem, every fear, every position she held, until she could hold them by their actual structure rather than by habit or performance. "Look," he would have said, "that's what it looks like when you do the right thing in the right place." He would have been practical about it, not grand. He was always practical about the important things. But he would have been proud. She let herself feel that. Standing in the yard, the evening light coming down golden over the stone walls of the estate, the village men dispersing back toward their homes and their families, Vivienne emerging from the house with her habitual efficiency and a look that took in the scene and the document case and Clara's face and filed all of it away with characteristic silence. Adrian appeared beside her, not speaking, not managing the moment, just present the way he was, fully, without reserve. "The building," Clara said after a moment. "The grain storage. When the inquiry is resolved, and it will be, you should rebuild it without waiting for the boundary matter to fully settle. The boundary ruling has gone your way twice. You hold the ground. Build on it." "Yes," he said. "And the Briggs family needs temporary storage for the harvest," she said. "Not charity. Formal use of space in the main estate outbuildings, with a rental arrangement that puts something in their account rather than making them a recipient. People keep their dignity better with a transaction than a gift." He turned to look at her. "I'm being practical," she said. "I know," he said. "You're always being practical." "Yes." "Clara," he said, and his voice had the quality it had in York for a moment, the settled thing, the thing past the careful openness into something more permanent. She looked at him. The evening light, the stone walls, the faint remaining smell of old fire, and under it the stronger smell of earth and season, and the particular realness of a place that was actually lived in rather than simply presented. "I know," she said. before he could say whatever he was about to say, because she was ready to hear it and she did not want either of them to have to manage the way it was said. "I know what you're about to say." "Do you?" he said. "Yes." She held his gaze. "And the answer is yes." He went very still. "I'm not confused anymore," she said, "about the plan or the distinction between need and want or any of the other careful accounting I've been doing since April. I know what this is." She paused. "I know what you are, not the reputation, not the London version. You. And I have been." She stopped because the sentence was very large and she wanted to say it accurately. "I have been falling toward you since a Tuesday afternoon in a lending library, and I am done pretending I'm standing still." The silence lasted the length of a full breath. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not the formal version, not the ballroom version, not any version that required gloves or distance or the performance of correctness. Just her hand in his, in the Ravenmoor yard in the evening light, plain and real and without ceremony. "I have been," he said quietly, "entirely yours since the first dance." She did not say anything. She held his hand and looked at him and let herself be looked at, and the evening settled around them with the specific piece of a thing that has been a long time coming and has finally, irrevocably arrived. From the doorway of the house, Vivian's voice. "I have absolutely no interest in interrupting, but Briggs's wife has sent supper and it is going cold, and I will not be held responsible for what happens if Clara misses another meal today." Clara laughed. She felt it through her whole body, and the first fully unguarded laugh she had produced in London or anywhere adjacent to London since the season began, the laugh of a woman who had stopped performing and was simply, straightforwardly, happy. Adrian was smiling. The real version, the one that reached further than it should, the one she had been cataloging since the beginning. "We should go in," she said. "We should," he agreed. He did not let go of her hand. They walked in together, through the door, and into the warm light of the house. And behind them, the Ravenmoor yard held the last of the evening sun for a moment longer before the shadows came, and then the day was done, and something else, larger, harder won, and considerably more permanent than anything either of them had arrived at the season intending, had just barely, finally, begun. The supper that Martha Briggs sent was a revelation, not in the grand sense. It was plain food, the honest northern kind, bread and a thick mutton stew and a jar of preserved plums that Clara suspected had been saved for something important, and offered anyway because gratitude sometimes spent its reserves without calculating the cost. They ate at the estate table in the main hall, the five of them, Adrian, Clara, Vivian, the steward, whose name was Hartley, and who turned out, over supper, to be a man of considerable dry intelligence. And the conversation moved between the inquiry's next steps and the estate's immediate needs, and once, briefly, to the question of where Clara and Vivian were sleeping, which Vivian resolved in approximately 45 seconds by informing Hartley which rooms she had already assessed as suitable and asking him to have them prepared, a directive he received with the slightly stunned compliance of a man encountering organizational competence in an unexpected form. Adrian watched this and then looked at Clara with an expression that said, clearly, that he was updating certain assessments in real time. She met his gaze with the calm of a woman who had made her position clear and was waiting for the world to catch up to it. After supper, when Vivian had retired and Hartley had gone to manage the household preparations, they sat together in the study, the same estate table, the same spread of papers, the fire down to coals, and went through everything that needed to happen in the next 2 weeks. The inquiry, the building, the Briggs family's temporary storage arrangement, a letter to Adrian's London solicitor about the boundary rulings enforcement timeline, a second letter to Pembridge confirming the formal request for his circuit's constabulary to secure the witness accounts before Crane's people could apply pressure. Clara wrote both letters. Adrian reviewed them, suggested one change in the second, which she accepted and incorporated without ceremony, and signed them both. "You amended the Pembridge letter," she said. "The phrasing in the third paragraph was slightly aggressive," he said. "Pembridge responds better to the appearance of confidence than to explicit pressure." "Fair," she said. "You know him better than I do." "I know him," he said. "You know the document." She looked at him across the table. "That's a good arrangement," she said. "I think so," he said. It was the simplest conversation they had ever had, and it was also, somehow, the most important. She wrote to her mother the next morning, a longer letter this time, the kind that required the whole desk and the good pen and sufficient morning light, which the northern summer provided in lavish quantities through the study window. She wrote about the village and Thomas Briggs and Sir William Pembridge. She wrote about the inquiry and the documentation and the specific practical work of the last 2 days. She wrote about Vivian, who had already reorganized the estate's household management system in some way that the cook seemed enormously relieved about. Then she wrote, "Adrian asked me to marry him last night, not in those exact words. He is a man who says important things sideways, which I have decided is not a flaw so much as a characteristic, and one I am apparently well suited to navigate. The answer was yes, and has been yes for longer than I was ready to admit. I know what you will think about the plan. I know you'll worry about whether I have thought this through, or whether I am being swept away by circumstances and emotion and the particular romantic compression that a crisis produces in proximity with a person one has been trying not to love. So let me tell you this. I have thought it through. I have thought through every version of it, the practical version, the emotional version, the version my father would have argued, and the version Mr. Farrow would have presented in his careful, apologetic monotone. And what I have arrived at is this. The plan was always to find a man of character who could secure the Grange and protect the people whose lives run through Whitmore land. I have found that man. He happens also to be the man I would have chosen if the plan had never existed. These two things are not a contradiction. They are, in fact, exactly what you told me to look for. His estate in Ravenmoor will make the Grange's situation look simple. It already does. He has been managing enormous responsibilities alone for a very long time and has been doing it well, which is to say imperfectly and with stubbornness and without enough sleep, which is how all hard things get managed. I want to manage them with him. I want that to be my life. I think it might be the best decision I have ever made, and I have made some good ones." She sealed the letter, sent it with the morning rider. Then she went to find Adrian, who was in the yard talking to Thomas Briggs about the temporary storage arrangement, and she stood at the yard's edge listening to the two of them work through the terms of it, straightforward, man to man, Adrian listening as much as he spoke. And she thought, yes, this is what I said yes to, this exactly. Margaret Whitmore arrived at Ravenmoor 6 days later. She came in the Hargrove carriage with her own maid and a letter from Lady Hargrove that Clara read and found both practical and unexpectedly warm. Lady Hargrove expressed in the language of a woman who had launched 3 daughters and knew the difference between a good outcome and a lucky one, that she was very pleased, and that she had always thought the Whitmore girl would do something unexpected with the season, and that she intended to take full credit for the introduction at the Alderton Assembly. Which is fair, Clara thought, since she did in fact provide the house and the vouchers and the mechanism, and the rest of us simply made use of it. Her mother emerged from the carriage and looked at Ravenmoor with the eyes of a woman who had been managing reduced circumstances for 3 years, and now found herself confronted with something substantially different. The broad stone face of the house, the well-kept grounds, the yard's busy order that spoke of a functioning estate rather than a failing one. Clara was at the door to meet her. They looked at each other for a moment. "You look different," her mother said. "I've been sleeping properly," Clara said. "And working. They have a similar effect." Her mother studied her. The lines around her mouth that had deepened over the winter were there still, but something in her carriage had changed. She stood slightly differently, Clara noticed, less braced, as though the news of the last week had released something she had been holding in place by sheer force. "He's here?" she asked. "He's in the study," Clara said. "He's been in there since 6 this morning working through the solicitor's correspondence about the boundary enforcement. I had to make him eat breakfast." Her mother looked at her. "Don't," Clara said. "I haven't said anything," her mother said. "You were about to." Her mother permitted herself the very small, very precise smile. "I was going to say," she said, "that the ability to make a stubborn man eat breakfast may be the most practically useful quality a woman can have." Clara felt something warm and enormously simple move through her. "You should tell him that," she said. "He'll appreciate the directness." "I intend to tell him a great many things directly," her mother said. I have questions. He'll answer them, Clara said. He answers questions honestly. It's one of the things about him that initially made me suspicious and eventually convinced me. Her mother looked at her for another moment. The morning light fell between them, clean and northern and real. Your father, her mother said softly, would have spent approximately 1 hour with him and then found an excuse to argue about something trivial for the rest of the evening, because that was how Edward expressed approval of someone. She paused. He would have approved. Clara felt the familiar ache, quick, sharp, loved rather than fought. I know, she said. I think he'd have liked the arguing part especially. So would Adrian, I suspect, her mother said. Without question, Clara said. They went inside. Miss The meeting between Margaret Whitmore and Adrian Blackthorne was not what Clara had managed in her head during the preceding 6 days of anticipating it. She had prepared for logistics, her mother's sharp questions about the financial settlement, about the Grange's position, about what specifically was being offered and in what form and under what terms. She had prepared also for her mother's careful examination of Adrian himself, the contained, precise assessment that Margaret Whitmore applied to everything she needed to trust, which was thorough and not always comfortable to be on the receiving end of. What she had not prepared for was the moment, 40 minutes into the first conversation, when her mother said something about Edward Whitmore's library and the particular way he had organized it, not alphabetically or by subject, but by some private taxonomy of his own that she had never fully decoded. And Adrian, who had been listening, said, he organized it by argument, I think, not by subject, by the position he was working through at the time he acquired each book. The books that arrive in clusters are usually the ones he was reading against each other. Her mother stopped. Clara stopped. How did you know that? Her mother asked. I have the same problem, Adrian said simply. It's a recognizable system to someone who does it. Margaret Whitmore looked at him for a long, assessing moment that was different from her earlier assessment, warmer somehow, without being less precise. Clara told you about the library? She said. She described him, Adrian said. Largely through what she'd learned from him. The system followed logically. Her mother set down her teacup. She looked at Clara. The look contained in the compressed language of 22 years, a complete sentence. I understand now what you meant by, he is not what he appears to be. Clara looked back with equal compression. I told you. Your Grace, her mother said, turning back to Adrian with the tone of a woman moving from assessment to business. I have some questions about the legal settlement regarding Whitmore Grange. I've had my solicitor prepare a draft, Adrian said. I'd value your review. I've been told it's accurate, but I want your opinion of the terms. Her mother looked at him again. You want my opinion of the terms? You've been managing the estate's accounts for 3 years, he said. You know the situation better than anyone except Clara, and Clara has already reviewed the draft and found 2 points she wants renegotiated. He glanced at Clara with something in his expression that was both acknowledgement and private warmth. I'd like a second perspective before the revision. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Show me the draft. He showed her the draft. She found 3 additional points. He accepted 2 immediately and argued the third. Not to win, but because it was genuinely complex and required the argument to clarify it. Her mother argued back. Clara, sitting to one side, watched her mother's shoulders over the course of the next 30 minutes go from the careful brace she had arrived with to something substantially more level, and understood that what she was watching was not just a legal negotiation. It was, in the language her father had taught her, an argument as a form of love. 2 people testing a thing to see if it held. It held. The inquiry into the Ravenmoor fire moved with a speed that surprised everyone except Sir William Pembridge, who had spent 40 years managing exactly these situations and knew what happened when documentation was clean and political cover was removed. Aldous Crane's men were identified formally by the 3rd day of the inquiry. Crane himself, through his solicitor, attempted 3 separate procedural maneuvers in the first week, all of which failed against the circuit magistrate's authority. On the 9th day, one of Crane's men, the one Jack Corey had identified by name, produced a formal statement of his own, which took the inquiry from suspected arson to confirmed arson in the space of an afternoon and redirected the investigation's focus precisely where it needed to go. Clara learned about the statement from Hartley, who came to find her in the estate's kitchen garden, where she had been doing something practical with the cook about the autumn planting schedule. Crane's man confessed, Hartley said, with the flat economy of a man who had been waiting for this particular news for 2 weeks and was declining to spend more words on it than necessary. What terms did he receive for the statement? Clara asked. Reduced penalty? His solicitor made the arrangement with Pembridge's circuit. And Crane? Will be formally charged before the end of the week, Hartley said. Pembridge has sent notification to the local magistrate's office. I believe the friendship there has recently become considerably less comfortable. Clara looked at the kitchen garden. The summer had been good to it, everything growing with the particular certainty of things that have good soil and sufficient attention. She thought about the boundary dispute and the delayed building and the 3 families and Thomas Briggs's bandaged hands, and she thought about what her father had said about the law, the most powerful tool available, properly applied. Tell Thomas Briggs, she said, before it's general knowledge. He should hear it first. Hartley nodded once and left. He had, over the preceding 2 weeks, developed a habit of nodding once at her directives and leaving to implement them, which had not been the dynamic at the beginning of her time at Ravenmoor, and which she suspected reflected some recalibration on his part that she did not intend to comment on directly. She went to find Adrian. He was where he often was at midday, at the estate table, correspondence around him, working through something with the focused concentration of a man who had many things requiring his attention and had organized them by priority rather than urgency. He looked up when she came in. She told him about Crane's man. He set down his pen. He was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of quiet that she had learned meant he was taking something in fully before responding. Pembridge moved fast, he said. The documentation made it easy to move fast, she said. There was nothing to argue about. The facts were the facts. He looked at her. The facts were the facts because you presented them as facts, he said. Not as my position or my interest or my version of events, just as observable, documented truth. That's how facts work, she said. Most people, he said, present facts as arguments, which gives the other side something to push against. You presented them as terrain. Crane has been trying to argue with terrain for 2 weeks, and terrain doesn't argue back. She considered this. That is a very good way of describing it, she said. I have my moments. He stood. I want to tell Thomas Briggs myself. Hartley's already gone, she said. He stopped. He should hear it from someone who knows what it means to him, she said. Hartley knows. He's been here for 15 years. Adrian looked at her for a moment. You thought of that before I did. You would have thought of it, she said. I just had the conversation with Hartley first. He was quiet for another moment. Then he crossed the room and he kissed her. Not for the first time. They had moved past the first time on the evening of her mother's arrival, in the quiet corridor after supper with the house settled around them. But with the specific quality of this particular moment, which was gratitude and something deeper than gratitude, the feeling of a person who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has recently discovered that they don't have to. She let herself be held for a moment, let herself simply be in it, without managing it or cataloging it or translating it into something more plannable. All right, she said after a moment, there's still the question of the grain storage rebuild, and I want to speak to Mrs. Halloway about the Dame School's winter needs before we go back to London. We're going back to London, he said. We have to go back to London, she said. You have an estate to manage from the capital for at least part of the autumn, and I have a wedding to arrange, and my mother needs to return to the Grange to oversee the autumn repairs, which your solicitor has already arranged the financing for. She paused. Also, Vivian has mentioned approximately 4 times that she has a husband in Lincolnshire who is beginning to wonder if she has been replaced by the county. He laughed again. She was keeping count. She had reached 11, and each one was better catalogued than the last. Then we go back to London, he said. We go back to London, she confirmed. She pulled back from him with the practical energy of a woman who had a list. He watched her return to the desk to begin it. Clara, he said. She said, finding the correct paper. I want you to know, he said, that whatever this is, what we're building, it is not what I came to London expecting. It is not what I have known how to want for a very long time. He said it simply, without performance or management. The way she had learned, he said, the things that mattered most. I want you to know that I know that. She looked up from the paper. I know that you know that, she said. I've known it since the lending library. He shook his head slightly. You've known it since longer than that. She considered this. Probably, she said. Yes. She went back to the list. London received the news of the engagement with the particular energy of a city that has been watching a story develop for 6 weeks and has finally received the resolution it was both expecting and not quite expecting in this specific form. The Duke of Ravenmoor, the notorious bachelor, the man who had survived 6 seasons without being caught, had been caught by a woman from Dorset, nobody's daughter in London's arithmetic, a debutante who had arrived in April with a failing estate and a sharp tongue, and had apparently proceeded to walk through the season's most dangerous social and literal fires and come out the other side engaged to the most powerful bachelor in the city. The story had everything London needed. It had the reputation and the challenge and the fire, literal and metaphorical. It had the surprising depth of character. It had Lady Price, who had been conspicuously absent from the social conversation since the week of the Beaumont ball, and whose silence on the subject of Clara Whitmore had been, as these silences always were, louder than anything she might have said. The morning calls that had stopped coming resumed. The invitations that had not materialized materialized. Mrs. Fenn, one of Clara's 3 strategic morning visits before the night in Adrian's study, called personally and said, over excellent tea, that she was very pleased with how things had resolved, and that she had spoken to 2 of the Almack's patronesses about the situation with Lady Price, and that certain social calculations in that quarter had been made. I didn't ask for that, Clara said. No, Mrs. Fenn agreed, but it was warranted, and I did it because warranted things should be done even when no one asks. She looked at Clara with the steady intelligence that had always made her interesting to observe. You've been running a very long game, Miss Whitmore. I've been trying to survive the season, Clara said. Yes, Mrs. Fenn said. Those are often the same thing. Eliza Marsden, who had remained in London longer than originally intended and had been staying with characteristic Vivian efficiency as a guest in the Ashworth household, came to call and sat with Clara for an hour over the kind of conversation that was not quite comfortable and not quite easy, and was entirely worthwhile. She was going home to the country, she said. Not in the way she had gone home before, not retreating. Going home because she had come to London to do a specific thing and had done it, and the country was, she said, actually where she wanted to be. I have a son, she told Clara, 2 years old. My husband is, she paused, a good man, kind. He married me knowing the whole history and has never once made me feel the weight of it. She folded her hands in her lap. That's what I wanted to tell you. Before you take on the business of being a wife, it's possible to find that. A man who marries the whole of you. Clara held her gaze. I know, she said. I did. Eliza Marsden left London the next morning. Clara watched the carriage from the window and thought about a woman who had come back to a city that had damaged her, with evidence she had assembled over a year for a stranger, and had done it because someone should have done it for me, and no one did. She would not forget that. She had decided, standing in the Cavendish Street study the night it all converged, that she would not forget it and she would not waste it. That the thing Eliza Marsden had done would have a use, going forward, beyond the single night it had been needed. She wasn't certain yet what form that use would take, but she was patient. She was her father's daughter, and his library had taught her that the best arguments were the ones you took your time with. The formal announcement of the engagement was made in the traditional channel, the Gazette notice, the family letters, the particular social circuitry through which London's aristocratic world conducted its official business. The notice was correct and formal, as these things were. The actual announcement, as far as Clara was concerned, happened in a drawing room in the Hargrove townhouse 3 days before the Gazette publication, when Lady Hargrove hosted a small gathering of the specific people who had been part of the season's actual story rather than its public performance. Vivian was there. Mrs. Ashworth, who had sat through the beginning of it at an evening assembly and had apparently decided from that first night to navigate what followed with the strategic patience of someone who trusted the conclusion would justify the journey. Mrs. Fenn was there, and Mrs. Alderton, who had hosted Clara's first London event, and who said, when she embraced her, "I knew at the Portman Square Assembly that you were not the usual article." Lady Hargrove, who had provided the house and the vouchers and the mechanism and had apparently been watching the entire proceedings with the quiet satisfaction of a very good chess player, said to Clara privately near the end of the evening, "You know, when your mother wrote asking for the season's assistance, I was not entirely confident. I worried you might be too stubborn for London." "I was too stubborn for London," Clara said. "No," Lady Hargrove said. "You were exactly stubborn enough. There's a difference." She squeezed Clara's hands. "Your mother is going to be all right. You know that." "I know that now," Clara said. "Good," Lady Hargrove said. "That was the thing that needed knowing." Adrian arrived halfway through the evening, having been delayed by a meeting with his solicitor about the Ravenmoor Boundary Enforcement's final documentation. He came in with the same quality he always had, the room adjusting around him, the attention orienting. But something about it had changed, Clara noticed. Not in him, exactly. In the room's response. The attention that oriented toward him now had a different quality than the London season's careful, performed interest. It was warmer, more genuine. The people in this room had been watching a story unfold, and the story had resolved in a way that meant something to them, not merely as entertainment, but as evidence of something they had been hoping was possible. He found Clara immediately. Across the room, through the conversation and the evening light and the assembled people, found her, as he always did, as though she were a fixed point he was navigating by. She raised an eyebrow very slightly. How was the solicitor? He lifted a shoulder almost imperceptibly, resolved. Vivian, who was standing beside Clara and had witnessed this exchange, said, "I am watching the two of you communicate without words, and finding it both impressive and slightly alarming." "We've had a lot of practice," Clara said. "You've known each other for 10 weeks, Vivian said. "We've had a very concentrated 10 weeks, Clara said. "Why?" The wedding was in September, at Ravenmoor. Not in London, though London would have preferred it. The spectacle, the assembled guests, the full social machinery turned to the event that the entire season had been building toward. Clara had considered it, done the accounting, and concluded that the church in the village at the edge of the Ravenmoor estate, where Thomas Briggs had been married and his children christened and 3 generations of the estate's tenants had conducted the serious business of their lives, was the correct place. Adrian, when she told him, said, "Yes." No argument, no negotiation. Just the simple agreement of a man who, when the right answer was presented, did not complicate it. The church was small and stone and smelled of old wood and the particular cold and warm mixture of a building that had been maintained for 200 years by people who valued the maintaining. Mrs. Halloway played the organ with considerable enthusiasm. Thomas Briggs sat in the 3rd row with Martha and their children, his hands no longer bandaged, healed to the shiny pink of new skin. Margaret Whitmore sat in the front row and did not cry, because she was Margaret Whitmore and she had made a practice of not crying in public, but her hands were folded in her lap with the tight, specific press that Clara recognized as the posture of someone managing something very large very carefully. Vivian sat beside her. At some point during the ceremony, Clara noticed their hands had found each other. Vivian's gloved hand over her mother's, quiet and steady. She stored that, also, in the specific place. Lady Hargrove had come north for the occasion and sat 3 rows back with the settled satisfaction of a woman at the conclusion of a well-managed project. She had brought Mrs. Fenn because the two of them had apparently decided to make the journey together, which Clara found both unsurprising and endearing. There was no magnificent address. The vicar, a mild man named Mr. Court, who had known Adrian since boyhood and clearly harbored considerable genuine affection for him alongside the formal respect, kept the service plain and direct, the way serious things deserve to be kept. When the moment came, Adrian turned to look at her, not with the careful control of London and the season and the machinery of reputation management. Without that. Just himself, fully visible, the way he had been learning to be and was now, standing in a stone church in his own village, in front of the people whose lives ran through his land. Entirely. She looked at him the same way. No performance, no management, no catalog of risk and plan and need versus want, just the plain, enormous fact of a choice that had been made with the whole of herself. "I do," she said, and meant it from the deepest available floor. The years that followed were not easy. She would say that later, honestly, when people asked, and people asked because the story of the Duke who had been caught by the impossible woman became, in London's telling of it, a kind of myth, and myths required the smoothing of difficulty into the romance of overcoming. She would not smooth it. She was her father's daughter, and she had no patience for false accounting. The Ravenmoor estate's legal battles with Aldous Crane were fully resolved by November of the first year, with Crane convicted of arson and ordered to pay restitution that he did not have, and that Adrian, after consideration, chose not to pursue through bankruptcy proceedings because the pursuing would have cost more in time and energy than it recovered in money, and because there were more important uses of both. The grain storage at the north edge of the village was rebuilt that same autumn. Proper construction this time, stone and timber, designed to last. Clara had opinions about the construction that she made known, based on the Whitmore Grange outbuilding's history of managing northern weather, and the finished building incorporated two of them. Hartley noted this in the estate records with the flat efficiency of a man documenting a useful precedent. The Whitmore Grange roof was repaired in the spring of the second year. Clara managed the project from Ravenmoor through correspondence with Mrs. Bates, who proved as reliable a project manager as she had always been a housekeeper. And the 2 acres of the eastern parcel that the Harlow family had been unable to fully manage were stabilized through a tenant arrangement that put 2 young men from the village on a working share. Their labor for a portion of the yield, no charity, a transaction that Harlow's eldest son had negotiated himself and was proud of. The school in Southwark received a new building in the 3rd year. This time the funding was not anonymous. Clara had argued for the change over 2 evenings of sustained discussion, which was how they resolved most things. Not quickly, not by one of them capitulating, but by both of them going at it until the best argument won. "You are not doing it for approval," she had said. "You never were. But you are now doing it in the context of a marriage, which is a different thing. What you do, we do. And I am not interested in continuing to be invisible about things that matter." She had paused. "Also, the children in that school deserve to know that someone specific is responsible for the fact that they have a building. Anonymity protects the donor. It doesn't do anything for the recipient." He had been quiet for a long time after that. Then he had said, "I hadn't thought about it from their side." "That's why you have me," she had said. "Among other reasons," he had said. She had won the argument. They put their names on the building's new lintel, Ravenmoor School, Southwark. Established, 1847. Maintained by the Duke and Duchess of Ravenmoor. London, over time, recalibrated. The story it had been telling about Adrian Blackthorne, the dangerous bachelor, the collector, the man whose attention was a game, encountered an increasingly irreconcilable conflict with the observable reality of the man, and London, which prided itself on being unsentimental, was also fundamentally an apparatus for the processing of new information, and it processed this. Lady Price, in the 4th year, attended a charity dinner that Clara had organized for the expansion of the Southwark School's programs. She came because 3 of her closest social connections had told her separately that the dinner was significant and that her absence would be noted. She sat at the far end of the room and watched Clara manage the evening with the easy authority of a woman entirely comfortable in her own event, and she did not speak to her directly. At the end of the night, as guests were departing, she passed Clara near the door and stopped. Clara looked at her. Lady Price looked back. "Miss Whitmore," she said. The old form, not the correct one. It was, Clara understood, the only acknowledgement available to her, the inability to use the correct title without admitting more than she was prepared to admit. "Lady Price," Clara said, simply, without victory and without performance. Lady Price left. Vivian, who had been beside Clara throughout the evening and was beside her now, said nothing. "That's as much as there is," Clara said. "That's fine." "It is fine," Vivian agreed, Some people are not capable of a different resolution. The question is whether you needed more than that. Clara considered it. The room around them was dispersing, the evening done, the work of it complete. The school's new program would receive its funding. The children in Southwark would have a full teacher for the winter term. Thomas Briggs, who had come down from the north with Martha for the event, had spent the evening speaking to 3 other tenants from other estates who had asked to hear about the Ravenmoor inquiry and its outcome, because word had moved, as word did, and other tenants in other counties were paying attention. "No," she said, "I don't need more than that." The morning she found the letter was 5 years after the season. She was in the library at Ravenmoor, her library now, hers and Adrian's together, the Whitmore volumes integrated with the Blackthorn collection in an organization that had taken 3 months to argue through and had produced a system that was, both of them agreed, superior to either original. When she found, tucked at the back of the shelf she was reorganizing, a book she didn't recognize. It was a small volume, unremarkable, the kind of thing a library accumulates without particular record. But inside the front cover was an inscription in a handwriting she didn't know. For A. Who will find the use for it when he is ready? M.B. 1831. A.B. Adrian Blackthorn. 1831, when he would have been, she calculated, 9 years old. M.B., his mother. She held the book very carefully, turned the pages slowly, reading the notes in the margins, small, clear, in the same woman's hand. Observations about the text, which was a history of property management in northern England, but also other things. A note that said, "The land remembers who tends it." A note that said, "The people are the point. Never forget that." A note in the margin of a chapter about inheritance. "It is not enough to hold it. You must give it better than you received it." And on the last page, in isolation, in slightly different ink, as though written later, "Find someone who sees what you are. Then let them." Clara closed the book. She held it for a moment, sitting in the library, in the room of organized arguments and accumulated thinking, in the house that was hers and was real and had cost everything she had been willing to spend and had given back more than she had known to ask for. She heard his step in the corridor, Shipkin. She knew his step, the particular rhythm of it. She would know it anywhere. And then the door. He looked at her. He looked at the book. "Where did you find that?" he said. "Find." His voice was careful in the way it was when something mattered and he was managing it. "Back of the left shelf," she said. "I was reorganizing." He was quiet. "She was right," Clara said. "Your mother." He came across the room and sat beside her. She showed him the last page. He read it, and she watched his face do the thing it did for the important things. The complete stillness that was not absence but absolute presence. The whole of himself gathered around something that mattered. "She would have liked you," he said finally. "I know," Clara said, not with arrogance, with the simple certainty of a woman who had read the margins and understood the person who wrote them. "I would have liked her." He took the book from her carefully and looked at the inscription a moment longer. Then he set it on the shelf, not back behind the others, in the front, where it belonged. They sat in the library in the Ravenmoor morning, the house quiet around them, the estate beyond the windows going about its necessary life, the yard sounds and the distant field sounds and the specific grounded music of a place that was genuinely, fully inhabited. This was the thing she had not known to name when she climbed into a carriage in Dorset and rode north toward a city she hated for a purpose she resented. This specific thing, this particular morning, in this particular room, this life built from argument and stubbornness and the willingness to stop pretending that the plan was the same as the truth. She thought about her father, about the arguments that had been love and the library that had been education and the debts that had been the forced beginning of something that had become, beyond any plan, beyond any account. She could have drawn up in the back of a carriage in the London fog, exactly what she had always wanted without knowing the name for it. She thought about Eliza Marsden, who had come back to the city that damaged her, about Mary Sutton, who had been afraid and done it anyway, about Thomas Briggs's healed hands, about Vivian, who had said, "You are the first person in 6 years who has spoken to him as though his reputation is not the whole of him." She had. She had looked at him without the performance layer from very nearly the beginning, and she had seen what was actually there and chosen it, not despite the difficulty, but because of it. Because the difficult things were the ones worth building. She reached over and took his hand. Not for the first time. For the 10,000th time, or near enough, and still with the same quality of intention she had first felt in the Ravenmoor yard in the evening light. The plain, enormous fact of choosing to be here. He turned his palm up and held on. Outside, the estate moved into its mourning. The land, which remembered who tended it, received the day with the patient certainty of something very old and very steady, and the house held the two of them in it as it had been built to hold things, firmly, without ceremony, for a very long time. The dangerous game was long over. What had replaced it was harder and better and permanent. And in the end, the greatest thing either of them had won was not the argument, not the resolution, not the acknowledgement, or the estate, or the rebuilt school with their names on the lintel. It was the morning. It was this. The plain, extraordinary, ordinary miracle of two stubborn people who had chosen, against every calculation and at full cost, to see each other clearly, and had found, in that seeing, the thing that made the world worth fighting for.